George Castriot, or Castriotto, surnamed Scandabeg by the Turks, among whom it was his lot to dwell many years, was the youngest son of a Grecian prince named John Castriot, who reigned in Epire, a country lying on the Gulf of Venice, and now called Albania, which name it also formerly bore, as well as that of Epire. Footnote: in the course of this work, the two names are used indifferently, and the inhabitants sometimes called Epirotes, sometimes Albanians. The exact division of the territory I cannot state. Footnote end. The family of Castriot had its origin in Macedonia, and anciently ruled over Epire with renown. John Castriot far surpassed his predecessors in prudence and magnanimity. He was of a hardy and invincible courage, and excelled in the qualities of mind, as well as in the comeliness of his person. His wife, named Voisana, is celebrated as a woman worthy of such a husband. She was daughter of the noble king of the Tribulians, renowned for her beauty and wisdom, and for the excellence of her spirit, far surpassing that of other women. She is said to have been the mother of 9 children, 5 of them daughters, named Mara, Gela, Angelina, Ulesa, and Memisa, and the rest sons, namely Raposius, Dionysius, Constantine, and George. This George, the youngest of them all, was born in the year 1404, and is the subject of the present work. It would be idle to mention the prognostics of Scandabeg's future greatness, which are by some related to have preceded his birth, but there can be no doubt, from the accounts given of him, that, being yet a boy, while he discovered great respect for religion, he took pleasure in manly and martial exercises, and together with uncommon bodily perfections, possessed a mind which promised such future excellence as to excite general attention and wonder. After the Turkish monarch Amurath II had reduced Greece to his obedience, and had afflicted Macedonia with a long and tedious war, by which it was brought to extreme misery, John Castriot, despairing of being able to offer any effectual resistance to the Turkish arms, sued for peace. This was granted to him, upon condition of his delivering up all his sons to the Turks as hostages. George, together with his brothers, was accordingly put into the hands of Amurath, in reliance upon his promise that they should be well and honourably treated. It is stated that the loss of George caused greater distress, not only to his father, but also to the common people, than that of all the other brothers, and that some persons appeared to entertain a presentiment that Amurath was about to nourish a domestic enemy, who was to bring confusion upon him and his family. No sooner had the Turk gotten these young princes into his power, than he violated his faith, and, to the great grief of their parents, he caused them to submit to the rites, and to be instructed in the tenets of the Mohammedan religion. At the same time their names were changed. George was surnamed Scandabeg, which signifies Alexander the Lord, or the Great. An ample allowance was, however, granted to them for their maintenance. The gentle disposition and tender age of Scandabeg, he being but 9 years old, rendered him more agreeable to Amurath than any of his brothers. He was provided with the best instructors in every department of learning, and, being endued with a prompt and ready intellect, he soon acquired the Turkish, Arabian, Greek, Italian, and Sclavonian languages. As his bodily strength increased, he delighted in nothing more than to improve himself in warlike exercises, without letting any one thing to overpass him, wherein he had not some knowledge and insight. Sometimes with his sword, sometimes with his bow and arrows, both on foot and on horseback, he gave daily proofs of wonderful readiness and agility, continually aspiring to some action beyond the powers usually possessed by one of his age. As soon as the strength of his limbs became equal to the impetuosity of his courage, and that he could show himself able to endure the toils of war, he constantly engaged in shows of combats and martial strifes, making these exercises a prelude to his future glory and renown. At the same time he framed himself to gain the favour and goodwill of all men, but especially of the prince. At length, when arrived at manhood with a full strength of body and a goodly stature, he accustomed himself to all such labours and hardships as might be endured by a powerful and able-bodied man, such as hunger, thirst, cold, heat, watching, and the like. And by these daily practices he rendered himself accomplished in all martial virtues, and fit to be employed in any military service. 1422. Amurath now raised him, being still very young, above the condition of a private person by conferring upon him the dignity of Sanjak, which is next in degree to that of Pasha. At the same time he was entrusted with the command of 5,000 horse. His brothers were also invested with similar charges, and sent abroad into various countries, where, by their conduct in military services, they procured for themselves an exalted reputation. Scandabeg had scarcely attained the age of 18 years, when, together with other forces, he was sent into Asia, where, with great valour and good fortune, he made his first essay in arms. Thenceforth, many broils occurring in those parts, rarely an expedition was undertaken in which Scandabeg, with his regiment, was not employed. On all which occasions his promptness, courage, and good fortune were conspicuous, and the happy success of the expeditions in which he was engaged was by all men, without contradiction, attributed to him, and to him alone, by the favour and acclamations of the soldiers, was adjudged the triumph and the glory of the enemy vanquished. There appears to have been somewhat in the character of Scandabeg during the early part of his career, which prevented his brilliant actions from exciting envy, and which gained the goodwill of all other men, as well as of the Sultan himself, who bestowed upon him not only gracious commendations, but munificent gifts and extraordinary favours. After a short abode at court, Scandabeg was again sent into Asia, in consequence of new troubles which had arisen there. He was now, with universal approbation, invested with the supreme command of the army which went upon the present service. In this expedition he surpassed all his former exploits, quickly vanquishing his enemies, and, as proof of his worthy deeds, over and above the testimony of his soldiers, bringing with him great numbers of prisoners, the spoils of the slain, many of the ensigns of the enemies, and multitudes of engines and instruments of war. All this triumphant success was achieved with scarcely any loss of his own troops, who, notwithstanding the numerous trophies gained from their enemies, scarcely exhibited any marks of injury to themselves. Amurath is said not to have so much wondered at the happy success of his actions, as to have admired his wisdom and prudence. In consequence of this victory, greater forces were placed under his command, and he was sent back, and ordered to remain in the same marches, until he should have reduced certain towns and districts in those quarters to subjection under the Turkish power. Fortune did not forsake the young soldier, but everything speedily succeeded to the utmost of his desire. Having fulfilled the duties which he had to perform, and the Ottoman Empire being enlarged beyond expectation, his renown began to extend even among foreign nations. Being returned to Adrianople, although no foreign enemies were heard of, he met with an adversary at home, to all appearance more dangerous than any against whom he had ever been opposed. An adventurer came from Scythia, who defied and challenged the whole Turkish court, demanding if any one dared encounter him in arms, and prove himself in fight against him. The order of combat which he proposed was that both champions should be stripped to their shirts, and, being enclosed in a straight and narrow place, should with their swords alone decide the issue of the contest. It is not possible to ascertain what prompted this barbarian to offer a fight so brutal and disgusting, whether he followed the dictates of a reckless and savage nature, or whether he thought, by proposing so horrible a danger, to deter all from accepting the challenge, and thus, without endangering himself, to retire with glory, and, perchance, with a reward for his show of valour. In order to animate some one of his servants to this combat, Amurath proposed a great recompense to whomever should engage it and come off the conqueror. There was no one who did not abhor the thought of obtaining honour by means so detestable, but the courage and lofty spirit of our Albanian overcoming every consideration, he advanced towards the Scythian, and, among other things, told him that although such kinds of fight were fit only for fierce and savage beasts, and that valiant men might and ought to decline them, yet that for once he would contemn and neglect the safety of his own person, and make a present of his blood to Amurath and to his own companions, to whom the Scythian answered in a contemptuous manner, calling him boy and child, for he was so young as to appear but a beardless youth. The place for the combat being then arranged as the barbarian had demanded, they were both stripped entirely naked, and thus leaping into the lists, they excited, by such an unwonted spectacle, an extraordinary interest in the minds of the beholders, and how be it, to use the language of Lavardin, that Castriot, by both his voice and by his countenance, did bewray himself in a wonderful resolution and assurance, notwithstanding an incredible kind of care, intermingled with grief, did assail the hearts of the regardants. And at one instant both the age and the comeliness of his person, joined with a gracious and pleasing carriage of all parts of his body, had them drawn both to honour and pity him. Goodly, high, and eminent was his stature, his arms so seemly as the like had scarce been seen, his neck strong and somewhat bending, such as is much commended in great wrestlers, his shoulders large and marvellously well spread, his visage of colour fair and white, and, as it were, stained with a little taint of purpure, the cast of his eyes straight and pleasant, without blemish or imperfection, and in all points correspondent and agreeable. These corporeal perfections did him great service to his other virtues, and the good qualities of his mind, which seemed to be augmented and increased by them. Each was armed with a short dagger, for the straightness of the place of combat did not admit of a longer weapon. A universal silence prevailed, both of them standing on their guard, and each ready to assail his adversary. The Scythian made the first onset, and directing his dagger against the belly of his opponent, thought to have stabbed him, but Scandabeg, bending his body like a bow, seized with his left hand the arm of the barbarian, and with his other hand so cut the monster's throat that he fell to the ground with his tongue still quivering in his mouth, while his huge carcass nearly filled the place of combat. It was speedily removed by those who stood near, and the courtiers, full of joy and exultation, flocking round the victor, led him unhurt into the presence of Amurath, to whom, with his hand still bloody, he presented the head of the Scythian, whereupon the rewards promised to the victor were delivered to him, which he received with apparent unwillingness, protesting that he had not risked his life for the sake of gold or silver, but to maintain the honour of the court, and to punish the arrogance of the barbarian. Not long after this he performed another exploit, which it may be well now to recount. At a time when Amurath made an excursion into Bithynia, more for pleasure than any serious business, Scandabeg made one of his train. There were at this time in the city of Bursa, once the capital of the Turkish Empire in Asia, 2 Persians named Iea and Zamsa, of a fair and goodly stature. They presented themselves to the Turkish sovereign, arrayed in sumptuous apparel, and asked for employment in his service. Each was so loud in praise of the other, and their manner was so vaunting and self-sufficient, that it appeared to indicate audacity rather than true valour. At length Zamsa, the younger of the two, told the Sultan that, in order to make proof of their courage, they challenged all his followers to take arms, that it might be tried whether he and his brother were worthy or unworthy to serve under the command of his Majesty. They were horsemen, armed only with a sword, lance, and shield, without any other armour for their bodies, and said that they would combat thus appointed. Amurath looked around to see if anyone would accept the challenge, and finding that none came forward, he at length addressed himself to Scandabeg, and invited him to enter the lists. He needed little encouragement to induce him to engage in the conflict. Having kissed the Sultan's feet, according to the Turkish custom, he called for horse and armour, and advancing, with great applause of the people, into the midst of a large plain appointed for the combat, and calling his adversaries to him, demanded of them what law of combat they meant to observe. It was agreed that Iea should first try his fortune, and that if he proved victorious, the fight should be at an end, but if he were vanquished, his brother should take his place, and continue the combat. The Sultan's servants who accompanied Scandabeg objected to the inequality of these conditions, affirming that it was not reasonable that, if he proved victorious over one, he should, though weary or wounded, have to encounter a second enemy fresh and sound. Scandabeg, however, did not refuse these terms, and when the ground was cleared of people, the trumpet gave the signal of battle, and the champions, putting spurs to their horses, made a full career at each other. The Persian fixed his lance in his adversary's shield, and couching close with all his force, thought to have unhorsed him, but, instead thereof, he shivered the staff of his own lance. The Albanian, on the other hand, who only ran at the head, altogether missed in his course, so that, both having run in vain, they held on their career, passing by each other, with the intention of betaking themselves to their cutlasses. But Zamsa, not waiting for the issue of the contest between the two combatants, advanced, and couched his lance against Scandabeg, who, perceiving the danger in which he was placed, and that he had no time for expostulating with his assailant on the treachery of his conduct, prepared to meet him, and pressing upon him with his lance, pierced him through the throat. Scarcely had this adversary fallen to the ground, ere Iea, rushing towards Scandabeg with sword in hand, and uttering a horrible cry, was on the point of slaying him. But, quickly wheeling his horse about, and returning upon Iea, with his sword also drawn, he sustained his onset, and, after 2 or 3 mutual blows, Scandabeg lighted upon his right shoulder, near to his neck, and with one blow gave him so deep a wound that the horse trailed along the body of his master, nearly divided in 2. Thus these 2 stout and hardy warriors, to the great joy of the beholders, were vanquished by the hand of one man. But had they escaped death in the conflict, they would not have escaped the wrath of Amurath for their base and treacherous conduct towards his champion. Castriot was conducted to the Sultan, charged with the heads of both his foes, in token of having gained a double victory. His former exploits seemed to be forgotten in the glory of this last achievement. The Sultan, the great lords, and his companions in general, honoured him with many and great presents, and styled him their avenger, and the author of their honour and renown. No one thenceforth enjoyed greater credit and authority with the Sultan, and no man was more beloved by the soldiers, inasmuch as he was courteous, friendly, and familiar in his behaviour towards them, not arrogating to himself any honours which were due to all in common. He liberally distributed among them whatever money came into his possession, rendering himself so popular that everyone was willing to range himself under his ensign, and for his sake to encounter any dangers. While his affairs were in this state, news reached him of the death of his father, John Castriot, in Epire. These sad tidings, as was natural, filled his mind with exceeding sorrow, but he permitted no outward sign of mourning to betray the grief that lay concealed within his heart, for he was wont so to carry himself towards the Sultan as though he were his own father. Upon the death of John, Amurath, as though he were the lawful heir of the realm of Epire, immediately dispatched thither Sebeli, one of his great captains, with a strong force, who seized upon Croia, the chief city, and other places of importance. And thus, without effusion of blood, Amurath obtained possession of all the fortresses and strongholds of the kingdom. Voisana, the widow of John Castriot, after the death of her husband, remained at home with her daughter Mamisa, and she had a small portion of land in Macedonia assigned to her by Amurath for her support. It is said that she died at a great age, before the return of Scandabeg into Albania, who, finding his sister Mamisa still unmarried when he recovered his kingdom, provided her with a husband, and restored her to her former dignity. Scandabeg concealed not only his grief for the death of his father, but also the resentment which he felt on account of the wrongs done under him. Amurath, on the other hand, not doubting that his treacherous conduct would be very ill borne by Castriot and his brethren, who were residing in his court, continued his disloyalty towards them. He made way with the 3 oldest, causing them, as many have affirmed, to be secretly poisoned. After this he turned his thoughts upon Scandabeg, considering in what manner he might secure himself against the danger which his suspicions represented to him, without depriving his realm of one to whom he looked, as to another Hercules, in all perilous and difficult adventures. There appears after this to have been a mutual distrust between Amurath and Scandabeg, the former endeavouring to conceal his evil purposes under specious offers and fair promises, and the latter lulling the suspicions of the Sultan by a show of affection and loyalty. The anxiety and grief felt by Scandabeg continued to increase more and more, and he considered it necessary to be very cautious with regard to his personal safety. The more suspicious he was of the designs of the tyrant, the greater was his care to gain the affection of the common people and of the soldiers. But being continually engaged in the tumults of war, his renown increased so much that envy grew up with it, and some of the courtiers, not being able to endure in a stranger the appearance of so great excellence, which every day became greater, took advantage of every opportunity to speak ill of him to Amurath, and to inspire the belief that his liberality towards those about him, and his endeavours to obtain popularity, were only prompted by a desire to rise to power and authority. Such discourses did not fail of making an impression upon the Sultan, especially as the munificence and liberality with which Scandabeg was charged were manifest and notorious, and the advanced age of Amurath, inclining him to be fearful, jealous, and suspicious, he saw everything in the worst light, and the apprehension arose by degrees in his mind, not only with respect to the realm of Epire, but for the sovereignty of his own empire. His guilty conscience also stirring within him, he began at length to entertain a secret hatred towards Scandabeg, and to watch for some opportunity to cut him off secretly. For, as he had no pretence for open violence, he dreaded by such means to effect his destruction, lest he should thus alienate from himself the hearts of the multitude, and, by such undisguised tyranny, deprive his kingdom of the services of foreigners of talent to whom the Ottoman Empire owed so much of its greatness. But these domestic intrigues were, for a while, interrupted by the weight and importance of foreign affairs, for war was declared against George, Lord of Mysia, commonly called the Despot of Servia. It is said that Amurath was induced by two reasons, which at first sight appear contradictory, to commit the charge of the expedition to Scandabeg. The one, that he could find no other commander so fortunate in war. The other, that he hoped that, in consequence of his readiness to expose himself to all dangers, he might, at length, meet with some mishap. Castriot was, consequently, sent against the Mysians. At this time, Castriot did not venture to deal with the Christians as moderately as he was wont to do when sent against them, lest he should excite the suspicions of Amurath, who was already but too much inclined to regard his actions with a jealous eye. He frequently defeated the despot, returning after all his conflicts, victorious, to Adrianople. And when the despot had renewed his forces, and began again to make head, Scandabeg, being anew dispatched against him, vanquished him in battle, and put his army to flight, and having razed many of his strongholds and fortresses, led back his own forces laden with the spoils of their enemies. Notwithstanding the important services rendered by Scandabeg to the Turkish state, Amurath continued his evil designs against him, in pursuance of which he caused a solemn joust and tournament, both on horseback and on foot, to be proclaimed, offering great rewards to those who should be victorious. This he did in order to expose Scandabeg to the great perils which would be attendant upon these exercises, but all his schemes proved abortive, for, though numbers of both subjects and strangers, hardy, active, and able men, daily presented themselves, Scandabeg, who continually showed himself among them, carried off the prize in every rencounter, to the great admiration of all men, as though he were fatally predestined to be victorious. The distrust of Amurath increased in proportion to the fame of Scandabeg, until, inflamed with anger and hatred, he became anxious to have him dispatched in some secret manner. Scandabeg was well aware of the disposition of the Sultan towards him, and being convinced that, if he remained about the court, he could not long avoid the snares which were laid for him, he set himself to devise some means of escape from the service of the Sultan, and of returning to his own country, where his presence was vehemently desired. Of this secret purpose he never by word or act gave the slightest intimation to any man living, although many of his countrymen lived on terms of intimate friendship with him. and many came to him in behalf of the chief and principal persons in Albania, offering him their aid to wrest his kingdom from the hands of the tyrant. But well knowing the inconstancy of mankind, and being aware of the great peril of the undertaking, he wisely continued to dissemble the purpose which he still kept in view. The chief difficulty which presented itself to him was how to recover possession of Croia, the principal city of Epire. It was defended by so large a garrison of the Turks, and its situation was so strong, being placed on the crest of a high and rugged mountain, almost inaccessible on every side, and also fortified by art, that to attempt to take it by assault would have appeared the effect of madness or folly. His only hope of success depended on some secret art or device. While in this state of suspense, Scandabeg prudently advised his countrymen to beware of rushing upon any desperate enterprise, by which they might rivet more closely the chains already put upon them, reminding them that their present servitude was not very grievous, and promising to use all his influence with Amurath to have it alleviated as much as possible. Thus he continued, with great wisdom and discretion, to repress the imprudent ardour of his countrymen until some opportunity of rendering them effectual aid should present itself. The time was approaching for Scandabeg to carry his design into effect. The despot of Mysia, whose discomfiture has been mentioned above, having been reinstated in his sovereignty by the aid of his friends, and the revolt of his people from the dominion of the Turk, Amurath determined to march against him in person. This he accordingly did, at the head of a force against which the despot was unable to contend, but fled into Hungary, leaving all his strongholds in possession of his enemies. It is said that the Sultan, in this expedition, availed himself of the aid and counsel of Scandabeg more than of any other of his officers. Amurath had scarcely brought back his troops to Adrianople, and licensed them to depart to their homes, ere new disturbances were threatened on the part of the Hungarians. For, at the instigation of Pope Eugenius, Ulaszlo, King of Hungary, took arms for the purpose of re-establishing the despot of Mysia. The Turkish emperor, thereupon, speedily reassembling his forces to the number of 80,000 men, he ordered the Pasha of Romania, named Cavalry, together with Scandabeg, to march at the head of 20,000 men into Hungary, there to meet the Christian army before it could enter the territories of Mysia. He himself, with the main body of his army, and the baggage, followed on by easy marches. The army of the Christians amounted to 35,000 men, commanded by the renowned Hunyadi, commonly surnamed Janusz, whose name alone, it is said, more than once vanquished the Turks. The Pasha, hastening forward, encamped near the river of Morava. Hunyadi, with 10,000 chosen troops, passed the Morava and attacked the Turks. This appeared to Scandabeg to be the opportunity he had so long sought for carrying into effect his design of liberating his country. Even at the commencement of the battle, he began gradually to retreat with his bands, and at length converted his retreat into an undisguised flight, by which example he struck terror into the rest of the troops, and a disposition to follow his example. The Pasha, much alarmed at seeing one so noted for bravery take to flight, and perhaps suspecting treachery, charged the enemy more faintly, and with less boldness than he would otherwise have done. The Hungarians, in consequence of this, easily broke and scattered the forces of the Turks, who abandoned their arms and baggage, and only sought safety in flight. Hunyadi, continuing the pursuit, made a great slaughter of the enemy, without much loss of his own troops. He plundered the camp of the Turks, and took many prisoners. The Pasha and a few of his followers with difficulty escaped. It is thought that Scandabeg had a secret understanding with Hunyadi, and that by his instructions he aided him in giving this great overthrow to the Turks. Scandabeg had, a little before this time, imparted his design to some trusty friends, and especially to his nephew, a son of Raposius named Amisa, a young man of singular courage and great promise. In the confusion of the Turkish army, Scandabeg kept a vigilant eye upon the Pasha's principal secretary, whom, during the flight, he, with his nephew Amisa, and other of his faithful friends, closely followed. When the opportunity presented itself, he set upon the Turks who accompanied the secretary, and slew every one of them. Having fast bound the secretary, he carried him to a place suitable for his purpose, and there compelled him, much against his will, to write counterfeit letters, as from the Pasha his master, to the governor of Croia, ordering him, in the name of Amurath, to deliver forthwith the command of the city and of the garrison therein to Scandabeg, the newly appointed governor. Many things were artfully interwoven with the substance of those letters, in order to give them the greater appearance of truth and probability. As soon as they were written, the secretary was also put to death, together with as many more Turks as came in Scandabeg's way, that these transactions might be kept as long as possible from the knowledge of Amurath, who, from hearing no news of Scandabeg, would naturally conclude that he had perished in the general slaughter of the Turks. Scandabeg arrived with wonderful celerity in the upper country of Dibra, or Dibria, in the borders of Epirus, about 70 miles from Croia, accompanied by 300 Epirote soldiers gathered to him out of the battle. The Dibrians were noted for their activity and valour, and much esteemed by Scandabeg on account of their fidelity, and for the many services which they had rendered in the protection and defence of the state under John, his father, when molested by the Turks. Footnote: Dibra was the only town or fortress in the parts of Epire towards Macedonia, with the exception of Svetigrad, the people of that portion of the kingdom being dispersed among the mountains and valleys, without any walled enclosures, protected themselves against the incursions of their enemies by favour of the natural defences of the country. Footnote end. Scandabeg had ordered his march so as to arrive at the town of Dibra in the night. He secretly sent for some of the principal people to come to him. Having made known his purpose, he was greeted with the most unbounded demonstrations of joy and affection, and every aid and service which could be rendered was proffered with utmost alacrity. He remained but one day at Dibra. Of the 300 men who accompanied him out of the battle, he selected a few whom he purposed to take with him to Croia, as though they belonged to his private service. The remainder, together with other 300 select soldiers from Dibra, he guided to go, by secret ways under the direction of skilful guides, through the woods and mountains, and approach as near as was possible to Croia without being discovered, and there to wait until he should get into the town, and be able to admit them also, in order to oppress the Turkish garrison. Early in the morning, before the break of day, it being towards the end of autumn, he, with a small company of attendants, took the way towards Croia. As he approached the city, he sent before him his nephew, Amisa, in the character of his secretary, with 2 attendants as servants, to give notice to the governor of his coming. This young gentleman being of a sharp wit, and well spoken, and possessing great courage, so well dissembled, that both in habit and speech he had the appearance of a native Turk, and being received into the city, he was conducted to the governor, whom, having saluted in the Turkish manner, he delivered his message from Scandabeg with so good a grace, and such an air of truth, and what he said was so implicitly believed, that the governor, before the arrival of Scandabeg, or that he had read the letters brought by him, began to make preparations to leave the place. When Scandabeg arrived, and delivered to the governor the packet of letters, he made no question of the truth of their contents, but immediately resigned to him the government of the city, and the next day, with all his household, departed from Croia towards Adrianople. Scandabeg, having thus obtained the government of Croia, was, by both the Turks and the inhabitants of the city, received with great satisfaction. The Turks were pleased with his manners, which were popular and familiar, and the Croians began to conceive secret thoughts of the real purpose of their prince. It was agreed upon between Castriot and a few of the citizens that they should rouse the minds of the young men of the city, and, when the time served, excite them to take arms. It was enjoined that no sign of the intended movement should appear until the men-at-arms who lay concealed near the city could be introduced within its walls. In the dead of the night following, they were accordingly admitted. Having disposed his forces in such a manner as he deemed most advantageous, Scandabeg gave the command to begin the assault upon the Turks. The sentinels upon the walls were first dispatched, and others put in their place. The private houses were then entered, and slaughter made of the Turkish garrison, with the aid of the armed citizens who joined in the attack. The massacre is related to have continued until Scandabeg was induced by the entreaties of the Turks to put an end to his proceedings until the following morning, in the hope that his victims might be induced to embrace Christianity. In the meantime he set guards throughout the city, and sent word of what had taken place to the Dibrians, exhorting them all to take arms, and to solicit their allies and neighbours to assert their liberty, and to expel the garrisons of their enemies before they should recover from their astonishment, and while Amurath was ignorant of what had happened, and occupied in the war against the Hungarians. He made the Dibrians to understand that as soon as he should have cleared the city of the Turks, and made the necessary arrangements therein, he would join them with the best and bravest troops that he could assemble. The next morning he caused it to be proclaimed with the sound of the trumpet that all who were willing to be baptized, and would come to him unarmed, should have their lives spared, and be admitted equally with other citizens to all places of charge and dignity, but that all who refused these conditions should be considered enemies, whom anyone was at liberty to put to death. The greater part of the Turks chose to encounter the threatened destruction rather than abjure their religion, and fell by the hands of the Christians, or by their own act. Castriot was induced to spare some, by their entreaties not to be forced through fear to assume the show of a profession which they could not make with sincerity, and to grant them life and liberty. This clemency, however, availed them little, for on their departure from the city they were without mercy set upon by the Christians. Those who consented to be baptized were well provided for at the public charge. A strict watch, however, was directed to be kept upon them until such a time as they should appear to be well settled in their new faith. Of those who had found the means to conceal themselves until the first commotion was past, some, upon making their appearance, were put to death. The rest were retained prisoners by such citizens as were of a more mild and merciful disposition, having large sums promised by the prisoners for their ransom. The city of Croia thus being happily recovered, the standards and ensigns of the Turks torn or burnt wherever found, and all vestiges of their former presence effaced, Castriot dispatched some of the principal persons of the city to the places within its jurisdiction, to acquaint the inhabitants with the success of his doings, and to rouse them to arms. But they needed no one to excite them, for they had almost all taken arms, waiting only for some one to be their leader. Wherefore, upon the arrival of Scandabeg's messengers, quickly forming a good and sufficient troop of enrolled soldiers, they went forward to incite others to do as they had done, putting to the sword all the garrisons of the Turks which they encountered. When a sufficient number of Epirotes were gathered together from different quarters, they returned to Croia, and Scandabeg, uniting all his forces, immediately proceeded by forced marches to Dibra, where he found Emesa with another good troop of soldiers, and all things settled and quiet. For he had, before the arrival of Scandabeg, expelled the garrison which the enemy had in that place. In the general destruction of the Turks, the governor of Croia, while on his way to Adrianople, was also attacked and slain, together with all his retinue, and his baggage seized and plundered. Scandabeg's first care was to station 2,000 good troops from the frontiers near to Svetigrad, as well as to intercept the escape of any enemies from within his territories, as to prevent any incursions which might be made from without by the forces of the Sultan. For in that quarter was the entrance into Epire most easy from Macedonia and Thrace. He himself, with the remainder of his troops, went into Lower Dibra, and here he met, among others, a person highly renowned for the nobleness of his blood and the greatness of his courage, Moses Galeem, who subsequently became a principal sharer and assistant in many important and difficult enterprises. He then approached the places and fortresses adjoining, which, not being surrounded by walls nor defended by large garrisons, offered him but little resistance. Thenceforth the inhabitants of the country universally rose up in arms, with the purpose to follow him whom they called the protector of their liberty. The shout of liberty was heard from the mouths, and the desire of liberty was felt in the hearts of all. Many Turks, according to some accounts, having assembled themselves from diverse quarters, made an attack upon the Christians, but being defeated, those who remained alive surrendered themselves up to the mercy of Scandabeg, who left it to the pleasure of his soldiers either to spare or to slay them as they thought fit. The greater part of them were put to death, only a few being reserved, in expectation of obtaining from them great ransoms. Scandabeg then divided his forces, and sent some of the principal young men into different parts of the country in order to stir up their friends and defeat their enemies. Amisa, with about 200 men, was ordered to enter Croia, that being the place of greatest importance and the principal garrison. He himself ranged about in all quarters, sometimes on one side of the country, sometimes on the other, and carefully attending to everything, spent several days in the recovery of places and in strengthening, by his presence, the goodwill and affection of all parties. After the recovery of Croia, the object of greatest importance was to get possession of the other fortresses within his realm, which were held by strong garrisons of the Turks. With this in view, he sent orders to those whom he had dispatched into diverse parts to increase their numbers as much as possible, and then to repair, as speedily as they could, to Croia. Scandabeg himself returned there, and awaited the arrival of his forces. He was not obliged to remain long, for his troops, greatly augmented in number, were there not long after him. He was joined by many noble captains, well accompanied, among whom were Masach de Angeline, his nephew by his sister Angelina, the two Stresses, Guac and George, also nephews by his sister Jella, and Jin Masach, the husband of Eulecus. Stefan Cernovich, who married Mara, sent him large succours both of men and money. All his sisters had been married to the nobility of the country, with the exception of Mamisa, who was given by Scandabeg to Masach de Thopi, after he had recovered his realm and restored it to peace. The forces which continued to arrive, at length amounted to more than 12,000 men. Scandabeg, feeling much encouraged by the zeal which his friends and subjects manifested, and seeing them eager and ready to march, resolved, first, to deliberate in full council upon the state of his affairs, and to address some words of exhortation to his army. The modesty of the address made by Scandabeg to his people was highly applauded, and the course which he advised to be pursued, implicitly followed. Moses, with 3,000 horse, was sent forward to Petrella, and was soon followed by Scandabeg himself, with the remainder of the forces. Petrella is a strong city, 25 miles from Croia, situated upon the top of a steep and rocky mountain, like the other cities of Epire, and well furnished by the Turks with men and munitions of war. Notwithstanding the strength of that place, Scandabeg had good hope that the Turkish garrison therein, terrified of the fate of Croia and the slaughter of their countrymen in the surrounding regions, would be induced to yield up the town upon reasonable conditions. With this end in view, Scandabeg, after he had established his camp, sent one of his men, a faithful and intelligent fellow, who followed him out of Hungary, to offer the garrison, upon condition of their delivering up the place, the option either to enter his service upon liberal terms, or to depart in safety with bag and baggage, and a large sum of money to be divided among them. The messenger performed his task with great ability. He set before the garrison of Petrella the example of Croia, exhorting them to bear in mind what that city had suffered, and to think how the dead bodies of their fellow soldiers were exposed to the dogs and wolves in every corner of Epirus, the truth of which they had learned from divers Turks who had fled for refuge into the town. Nor did he fail to remind them that Amurath, having lately lost a great battle against the Hungarians, and being engaged in other wars, had no leisure to turn his attention towards Epire. He concluded by offering the conditions above mentioned. After a short delay, the governor accepted the proffered terms, all but the tender to him of a large sum of money, lest he should be suspected by the Sultan of having been bribed. The Turkish governor, accordingly, with his garrison, evacuated the city, and were supplied by Scandabeg, agreeably to his promise, with provisions and money for their journey, and sent under a sufficient convoy safely out of Epire. The easy recovery of this town has been thought to afford an evidence of the favour of Providence towards Scandabeg, for, although Petrella be small in circuit, its position on top of a high mountain renders it impregnable. It was also well provided with men, arms, and other munition, yet, in the winter season, at which time an attack would have been most desperate, it yielded to him without resistance. When Petrella was thus gained, Scandabeg made no delay, but having put therein a sufficient garrison, he neither entered the town himself, nor permitted any so to do, except the soldiers appointed to defend the place, although his men at the time were suffering much from the severity of the cold. He immediately directed his course to Petra Alba, distant from Petrella 30 miles, and as much from Croia. In such haste, says Knowles, as if the city had been running away from him. Lavardin calls it a castle in Emathia, on the summit of a mountain near the river of Emathus. As soon as Scandabeg had encamped before this place, a messenger was sent to him with an offer to surrender the place upon the same conditions which had been granted to Petrella, which, being agreed upon, the place was without delay given up, and the agreement entered into faithfully performed by Scandabeg. Petra Alba being thus recovered, and all things in it well ordered, Scandabeg proceeded without delay to Stelusa, distant from Croia 50 miles. It is a small place, but strongly and very delightfully situated, upon the top of a high hill in Emathia, surrounded by pleasant and fruitful plains. Scandabeg encamped near this stronghold a little before sunset, and remained quiet that night. In the morning he summoned the place, offering the same conditions which had been received by Petrella and Petra Alba. The greater part of the garrison were desirous of accepting these terms, but Desdrot, the governor of the town, with a few others, resolutely refused them, whereupon a fierce contest arose between the two parties in the garrison. At length the majority set upon the governor and his adherents, and delivered them fast bound to Scandabeg, at the same time yielding up the fortress. Those who had thus betrayed their commander, being afraid to expose themselves to the vengeance of Amurath, either remained with Scandabeg and became Christians, or were provided for without a change of religion, or were well rewarded and suffered to depart where they would. There remained yet the city of Svetigrad in the possession of the enemy, for the weaker Turkish garrisons in Epire, when they heard that the strongest places were recovered by the Epirots, soon delivered themselves up to Scandabeg. Svetigrad, which in the Sclavonian language means the Holy City, is situated on the frontiers of Epire, in the upper country of Dibra, like an eagle's nest, upon a high and steep hill. To this city Scandabeg advanced, with all his forces, and having pitched his tents and arranged his camp, he demanded a parley with the inhabitants of the town. He endeavoured at first to gain the place by composition, as he had done the rest, and to that end directed his messenger to declare what had happened at Croia, Petrella, Petra Alba, and Stelusa, especially to set forth his liberal treatment of the garrison of the last place, and to say that the governor thereof, who was in his hands, should, together with his partisans, be executed in their sight unless they delivered up the city. To this message the governor, not being certain of the disposition of his men, was doubtful what answer to return. He therefore first received and entertained the herald with courtesy, after which, addressing himself to his soldiers, and styling them valiant and faithful men, he demanded of them what answer should be returned to their enemies. Whereupon one of the soldiers, a rough, bold fellow, brandishing aloft his sword, is reported to have made the answer to this effect: "Captain, since you call us valiant and faithful, and consider Scandabeg as our enemy, this my sword shall make answer for us all. Why should we be told of what has happened at Croia and Stelusa? Do they think to break down the courage of brave men? The minds of men are as various as their countenances, and each man should judge for himself. We gave no laws to them of Petrella, nor of Stelusa, nor will we receive any from them. Let us take care that we be not corrupted by the examples of those base and infamous slaves. Courageous and independent minds not only disdain to be imitators of what is disgraceful, but are unwilling to be directed by others even in honourable actions. Let Scandabeg slay, before our eyes, the governor of Stelusa and his companions. Do you think that we shall die in their bodies, that our spirit shall be extinguished in theirs, or our blood spilt in them? Happy are the bodies, and worthy of all honour are the souls of those men who, in their desire to maintain their faith and preserve their liberty, equally despised gold, silver, the sword, and all that the miserable nature of man covets most, or is most afraid of. Herald, return to our enemy, and carry to him this message from a private soldier. Tell him that if he intend to impose terms upon us, let him show the strength of his arm, which is not dreaded by men of courage. He may bring us into subjection, if God be not for us. But I am sure he shall never do it by persuasive words. Nor does your Scandabeg show himself the man which he is said to be, of a kind and gentle spirit, ready to forgive, and no less just to his enemies than to his friends. Why is the governor of Stulusa kept prisoner, who, for his king, for his faith, and for his liberty, bravely, and as became an honest man, spoke his opinion? Why is he to be butchered by the hands of the executioner? He does not deserve to be put to the sword, and to suffer death who has so nobly hazarded his safety for the preservation of his liberty." When this speech, which had been attentively listened to, was ended, the soldiers thronging around the speaker, and beating together their swords and targets, gave a great shout, in token that they approved of what had been said. The governor, being encouraged by the disposition which his troops manifested, sent away the herald with no other answer than that of the common soldiers. When this answer of the soldier was returned to Scandabeg, he smiled and said, "He is, no doubt, a valiant soldier, if his deeds correspond with his words. But God willing, we will send him also to keep company with those happy souls of the Stelusans." He then ordered the governor of Stelusa and the other captives to be brought before him, unto whom, presenting a crucifix, some consented to be baptized, to the great grief of the other Turks. Distraught the governor, and the others, who refused to change their religion, as a terror to the defendants, were in their sight put to death, whereupon the soldiers of the garrison gave a shout from the walls, and bitterly railed upon the Christians. The governor of Svetegrad set all things in order for the defence of the place, sending out of the town the Christians and former citizens who had been suffered to remain. He also spoke words of commendation and encouragement to his men, and after having made his arrangements, he quietly awaited the attack of the enemy. A diversity of opinions with regard to the manner of carrying on the operations against Svetegrad existed in the camp of Scandabeg. Some were for deferring all operations against the city on account of the advanced season of the year and the inclemency of the weather. Others thought that an immediate assault should be made by a chosen body of men. But a third opinion, advanced by Moses Golemus, a valiant captain, finally prevailed, which was that the forces to be maintained upon the borders of Epirus, for the purpose of repelling any attempts of the enemy from abroad, might serve at the same time to keep in check the garrison of Svetegrad until Scandabeg should find it convenient to return to the siege. Moses was, accordingly, left with 3,000 troops before the city to perform this double service. Scandabeg then, with the rest of his army, returned to Croia, having, says Knowles, in the space of a little more than 1 month, to his immortal praise, recovered his kingdom, and driven the Turks out of every corner of Epirus, excepting only Svetegrad, which city also, not long after, was, by composition, delivered unto him. During all this time, from his first coming into Epirus, he never slept above 2 hours in a night, but with restless labour prosecuted his affairs. He ever fought against the Turks with his arm bare, and that with such fierceness that the blood did oftentimes burst out of his lips. It is written that he with his own hand slew 3,000 Turks in the time of his wars against them. But of his great and worthy victories obtained against the 2 mighty Turkish kings, Amurath and Mahomet his son, more shall be said hereafter in due time and place. A council being held upon the return of Scandabeg to Croia, there was a diversity of opinion as to the future proceedings of the army. Some were very unwilling to intermit the war, but wished to follow up their victory and invade the enemy's territory in hope of winning something from the Ottoman Empire. Others alleged the unfavourable time of the year for such an expedition, as the snow and frost and rains would render the service extremely distressing to the men, and the fields, during the winter, would afford no sustenance to the horses. Scandabeg yielded to the latter opinion, both to manifest the care which he had for his troops, and to take advantage of this time of rest to put his country into a better posture of defence. He accordingly dismissed his troops, after having first expressed to them his grateful sense of their conduct. He told them that he did not know which most to commend, their virtue or their good fortune, which had gone hand in hand and mutually aided each other. That, from what they had already done, he drew a presage of the future glory of Albania, and of their honour and renown. That it was hardly the 30th day since he, full of doubt and uncertainty after his long absence, set foot again in his native country, while in the possession of infidels and miscreants, of whom, Svetograd excepted, not a vestige was left remaining in the province. He told them that they ought, before all, to render thanks to God, that he had so blinded the understandings of their adversaries as to induce them to deliver up, without resistance, the possession of such good and strong fortresses, that their patience and endurance of hardships, and their steady perseverance in the pursuit of the object they had in view, spite of the severity of the weather and the inclemency of the season, merited great praise and commendation, that he admired the spirit of those who were unwilling to lay down their arms, but that, if no harm was likely to result from a little delay, it would be well for them to take care of their bodies, and to remember that they were but men. He bade them, therefore, to retire, while crowned with victory, to breathe and refresh themselves, for that they should have wars and military expeditions in abundance. After touching upon the probable course that would be pursued by Amurath, and what their own manner of proceeding ought to be, he observed that the feast of the Nativity of Christ, our Saviour, was at hand, and that he did not feel inclined to attempt anything during these festal days of life and light, by which any should be deprived of life, but that all should rather offer up daily vows and prayers and thanks unto God for their liberty, their state and empire, their wives and their children, and for themselves, thus freed from the bondage of their enemies. He concluded by assuring them of the good hopes which were excited in him by the presence of so many valiant youths and brave captains, and of his desire to do all in his power to reward their services and procure them honour and reputation, for which reason he desired that all should utter their thoughts and freely open their minds unto him. Hereupon, not only the persons of the lower classes, but even some of the better sort, were so emboldened by the liberality of his speech that they flocked around and urged upon him various petitions, some desiring the pay of horsemen and some of footmen. Others asked for money and horses, or for the rents, revenues, and livings, and many were importunate to have restored to them the possessions of which they had been despoiled by the Turks upon the change of government, which took place when Amurath made himself master of Epire. What could be conveniently done without contention was freely granted to them. What could not be immediately executed without injury to others was deferred to a future time. When the officers were dismissed, and Scandabeg with his own train had entered into the town, the first thing he did was cause Amisa and some other of his companions who came with him from Hungary, and a number of Turks who yet remained in Croya and other places, to be admitted into the communion of the Christian faith by the sacrament of holy baptism, which had not been performed with respect to the Turks in consequence of the haste with which it was necessary to prosecute the war. This ceremony taking place during the feast of Christmas, it was celebrated with much joy for many days. The inhabitants of the country, both publicly and privately, sent Scandabeg, as was customary, many presents. The princes, his neighbours also, as they had not long before presented him with gifts serviceable for war, now sent to him things suited to a time of peace and public tranquillity, such as furniture and valuable household articles, knowing well that he had brought nothing with him into the country besides his arms. Scandabeg did not long enjoy this repose, for, in the midst of the festival, news came suddenly from Moses that a number of Turks who had fled from Epire into the neighbouring province intended to surprise him. Upon this news, Scandabeg himself hastened to join Moses, lest that general should be enclosed between the invading forces and the garrison of Svetigorod, or be obliged to abandon the watch which he kept over that city. This alarm, however, was found not to be attended with any great danger. It was occasioned by the remnants of the garrisons of Petrella, Stlusa, and Petralba, which had escaped out of the hands of the Epirotes, and who, perceiving all to be quiet in Albania, that Scandabeg had broken up his camp, and was passing the winter at Croia, and that Moses, with his troops, was near to Svetigorod, on the frontiers of the land, rallied together near Makriya, a small town in Macedonia, under the dominion of the Ottomans, and joining them to a number of others, they marched directly towards Svetigorod, both with the desire of revenge, and in hope of performing some service by which they might, in the eyes of their master, obliterate the ignominy of their former conduct. Although the Prince of Albania was not himself much moved by this rumour, yet, in order to avoid the appearance of negligence and of abandoning Moses, he mounted suddenly on horseback, and accompanied by those who with him were celebrating the feast, and about 100 horsemen of the town, went forward to meet the threatened danger. As soon as the Turks perceived the approach of Scandabeg, they retired in such haste as to leave no trace behind them of their attempt. This their folly, however, was the cause of great mischief to their land, for Scandabeg, incensed at their audacity, took 1,000 horse of the troops of Moses, and made such an inroad into the Turkish borders as provided his soldiers with victuals and munition for the residue of the winter, so enriching them that they desired no better pay, which was so usual a thing with this enterprising prince, that it grew into a common saying in the courts of princes that the spoil of Amurath's dominions was Scandabeg's revenue. When Amurath became acquainted with the particulars of all the disasters which Scandabeg had brought upon him, it is said he at first was so overcome as to remain for a time without uttering a word. But his feelings at length burst forth in violent exclamations, complaints, and threatenings, tidings continuing to arrive from different parts of Epire, and the successes of Scandabeg, how that Croia was taken by him, and that he had obtained possession of other important places, the garrisons of which were slain and dispersed, and that, in fine, the whole estate of his ancestors was recovered by him with incredible favour and goodwill of the nations. The grief and vexation of Amurath was still more exasperated. Still he resolved, setting aside all other things, to bend his thoughts towards the war with Hungary. The opinions of Amurath's counsellors were divided in regard to the course to be pursued. Some were for bending at once the Ottoman strength against Scandabeg, that he might be crushed before his power should be established. Others again were in favour of prosecuting the war with Hungary, without suffering it to be interrupted by the revolt of Scandabeg. Amurath finally agreed with the Hungarians upon a truce for 10 years, with other conditions which it is unnecessary here to mention. He did not, however, immediately proceed to take vengeance of Scandabeg, but suffered the winter and spring following, and part of the summer, to pass over before he aroused himself. Scandabeg, having taken leave of Moses, returned from Dibra to Croia, where he passed the greater part of the winter in attending to the affairs of the state and to individual concerns. Upon the approach of spring he took with him a Mesa and a few horse, and went forth to levy forces, and having mustered 6,000 men, he went direct towards Svetigorod. But this demonstration proved of no avail. Neither the difficulty of the siege nor the obstinacy of the defenders was diminished. Neither threats nor promises could avail anything. He was without artillery, and even if he had been supplied therewith, it is not probable that it would have enabled him to reduce the place, and it appeared to be a course of great imprudence and temerity to make an attempt which threatened not only the certain peril of his forces, but their probable ruin and destruction. Wherefore, in accordance with the opinion of the majority, he for the present abandoned the proposed attempt upon Svetrograd, and resolved to turn his arms elsewhere. But, before departing, he proceeded to lay waste to the environs of the town, in order to distress the inhabitants thereof. It is, however, reported that some of them came secretly to Scandabeg, and entreated him that, in regard of their past services to John his father, he would not utterly destroy everything, by which proceeding he would do more harm to them than to the Turks, and that these and other motives which were urged induced him to grant their request, seeing he had no reason to doubt the faith of men who were Christians, and who had been the subjects of his ancestors. There was a country called Makriya in the vicinity of the dominions of Scandabeg, which was exceedingly pleasant and well peopled, and containing many large towns and boroughs. Towards this country Scandabeg led his army, and, taking possession of it, added it to his dominions, thus extending beyond the bounds of his father's empire. There was not an enemy to be found in all the country, for the Turks, before that, had either been expelled or voluntarily retired from those parts, and the inhabitants, of their own accord, enrolled themselves in the service of Scandabeg, and marched under his ensigns and the eagles in time past well known to them. Footnote: For in his standards, which were gules, he bore an eagle with 2 heads sable, these being the ancient arms of his family. Translation of Lavardin. Footnote end. Passing on from Makriya, sometimes showing himself gentle and lenient, and at others severe and terrible, he daily added to his conquests, and thus increased the extent and richness of his dominions, at the same time continually taking order for one thing or other, appointing guards for the passages, and providing for the garrisons. He frequently visited Croya, and examined all other places of importance, being seldom idle or quiet, but riding to and fro, he made himself acquainted with the mountains, hills, forests, thickets, caves, dens, and secret lurking places, all which care was with the view of rendering himself more able to defend the country against the expected invasion of the Turks. The little leisure which he had was employed in making inroads into the territory of his enemies. He avoided nothing more than to suffer his men to be corrupted by idleness, having continually in his mouth this saying of Fabius Maximus, that it was not good for an army to continue long in one place, but that frequent change of their place and camp was far preferable, and would much better fit them for military service. These things could not fail to reach the ears of Amurath. Messengers came to him from Phasalia and other parts of Macedonia, filling his palace with clamour and outcries. It was reported that Scandabeg had gotten possession of many places, and was daily pursuing his conquests with his wonted fierceness and severity, that both one and the other Dibria had voluntarily surrendered themselves to him, killing with their own hands the Turkish garrisons, or delivering them up prisoners to their new lord. These marches of Upper and Lower Dibria of old appertained to John Castriot, who had been constrained to yield them to Amurath. Those who brought these accounts to Amurath set forth that, in consequence of the revolt of the Dibrians, the Christians would soon be the masters of Svetrograd, being seated in Upper Dibria, and consequently unable to procure supplies from the surrounding country, that Makriya and other places which were not of the domain of John Castriot had declared for Scandabeg. By all these accounts, Amurath was of necessity stirred up to arms. After having assembled his council and fully deliberated upon the state of affairs, he gave orders that a powerful army should be levied, by which he thought to extinguish the name of Scandabeg, and avenge himself for the revolt of the Albanians, and the many injuries which he conceived himself to have suffered from them. Scandabeg also, on his part, was certified of the designs of the Turk, not only through persons unknown to him, but also by some of his friends, of whom he still had many about Amurath. Being wonderfully bold in exposing himself to all sorts of danger, He at the same time discovered singular prudence and wisdom in all his conduct, for as he foresaw that he should have to maintain a very severe struggle in the defence of his dominions, into the heart of which the war would probably be brought, and that his own resources might be insufficient to carry him through the contest which awaited him, he determined to seek the aid and alliance of the neighbouring princes and nobles. In order to facilitate this object, he deemed it most advisable to invite them to a conference in some convenient place. He accordingly chose a town appertaining to the Venetian dominion, named Lissa or Alesia, distant somewhat more than 22 miles from Croia. This place was thought suitable, not only on account of the convenience of its situation, but because the government of the Venetians was generally liked for its mild and gentle character. Those who were invited showed no backwardness or delay, for none refused to attend the conference, and all exhibited the greatest alacrity and zeal in the cause of Scandabeg. The princes and nobles being assembled in the great church of Lissa, Scandabeg addressed a speech to them, which it is said was much approved and highly applauded by the assembly. He was unanimously chosen the commander-in-chief of the armies, and to his sole direction was committed the conduct of the war. He was esteemed most worthy of the honour bestowed upon him on account of his skill and science in military affairs, his great prudence and deliberation, his long acquaintance with the manners and customs of the barbarians, and his wonderful judgment, which was confirmed by long use and daily experience. For all these considerations, an assured hope of success was entertained by those who displayed this confidence in him. His allies all voluntarily taxed themselves for the support of the war, except the Venetians, who would not bind themselves to pay a stated subsidy, but promised to be ready at all times to afford any aid which might be required. After the business of the assembly was concluded, and prayers had been offered up and processions made for the strengthening of the league, Scandabeg was by some accompanied to Croia, and the rest betook themselves to their own homes. The city of Svetograd had been so closely pressed by Moses that it had surrendered to him, and he and his troops had been recalled, except those with which he garrisoned the place, and a few who were left upon the mountains in order to maintain a careful lookout. The troops thus recalled did not amount to more than 5,000 men, as Scandabeg had previously licensed many to depart. But commissions were now made out, and officers appointed, and dispatched to various parts in order to levy forces. During these transactions in Epire, it must not be supposed that Amurath remained at ease, and unoccupied with the care of the war against Scandabeg, upon which he had resolved. He caused an army of 40,000 men to be raised, and committed the command to Hali Pasha, a leader of tried valour in action, and of approved wisdom in council, and who, by his merit, had risen to great military honour, whose high reputation, as well as that of his troops, inspired the Turks with full assurance of an easy triumph over the Albanians, and caused among them as much appearance of exultation as though Scandabeg were already taken prisoner, and was going to execution. With respect to the inhabitants of Epire, they were much alarmed by the rumour of the Turkish preparations. The country people, driving their cattle before them, betook themselves to the walled cities for protection, and the townspeople strengthened their fortifications and stationed guards, as though the enemy was close at hand. The aged men and the women encouraged those who could bear arms to exert themselves in their defence, and offered up prayers and vows to heaven for the preservation of their country. As to Scandabeg, he was not at all moved by any of these things, neither by the prospect of a Turkish invasion, nor by the greatness of the enemy's preparations, nor by the terror of his own subjects, but made light of the threats of Amurath, and derided the fears which they excited. He nevertheless put everything in readiness throughout his dominions for the reception of the enemy, and so encouraged and inflamed the hearts of his soldiers that they wished for nothing more ardently than for the approach of the enemy. It is supposed that he had information of all Amurath's designs by means of secret friends at the Turkish court. Having ordered everything for the safety of his country, he began to levy an army at Croia. Most of his subjects of Epirus, who were capable of bearing arms, then repaired to him. The Confederate Christian princes also, his neighbours, many of whom were his kinsmen, furnished him with great supplies. Other devout and warlike Christians also resorted to him from far in great numbers. Out of this multitude, which might have afforded him a very large army, he selected 8,000 horsemen and 7,000 foot. The remainder, with the exception of such as he placed in certain frontier garrisons, he licensed to depart home again. It was a matter of great wonder to both the friends and foes of Scandabeg that he should take the field with so few forces, when he might have had so much larger an army under his command. But Scandabeg himself was wont to say that the quality of an army was more to be depended upon than the size of it, as will be noted hereafter. Before commencing his march with this small army of 15,000 men, Scandabeg addressed his men in an animated speech, by which he stirred them up to an ardent desire for the combat. And then, having given orders for their pay, and divine service having been devoutly celebrated, he proceeded to the lower Dibra, and encamped towards sundown about 80 miles from Croia, near to a mountain full of woods, or rather to a forest of lofty trees directly in the way which it would be necessary for the Pasha to take, of whose approach he had received notice by means of his espials. Within this wood he placed Ne Musak and Amisa with 3,000 horsemen in ambush, and gave them orders to lie close until they should see him completely engaged in battle with the Turks, and then rush with their utmost force upon the rear of the enemy. Scarcely had Scandabeg placed his men in ambush before the Turkish forces made their appearance, and the Pasha came and encamped near to the Albanians a little before the setting of the sun, and remained there that night. Many fires were kindled in his camp, and sounds of great mirth and joy were heard. Scandabeg, on the contrary, ordered all to be silent, and no fires to be lighted in his camp, and directed those who were not wanted on guard to take their rest, whereby he rendered the Turks less vigilant, as they supposed him to be intimidated and discouraged. During the night the Turks approached his camp, and used insulting language towards his soldiers, but he commanded all to remain quiet, and take no notice of the barbarians. When the moon rose, he first caused his troops to take refreshment, and he then drew them out, and, that he might obtain some knowledge of the strength and order of the enemy, directed his horsemen to engage in light skirmishes with the Turks. He then in the morning arranged his army in the following order. On the left wing he placed Tanusi, with 1,500 horse and the like number of foot. In front of the cavalry he intermingled a number of archers on foot, that the battle might be begun by them, and that the rest of the infantry might be able to come speedily to the charge, and to retire if hard pressed, notwithstanding the engagement of the horsemen. Moses, who commanded the right wing, composed of Dibrians, ordered his battle in the same manner, but in what manner soever the Dibrians might be arranged, and whether foot or horse, they were sure of performing their duty, and seldom failed of being victorious. Between the wings were arranged the remainder of the forces, bending inward in form of a crescent, commanded by Scandabeg himself. 1,000 horse were likewise in the front of his division, for, as the forces of the enemy were devoid of infantry, it was not deemed advisable to expose his troops to the first fury of the onset of the enemy's cavalry. Next to these 1,000 horsemen were placed nearly a like number of archers on foot, who were well trained and skilled to accompany the horse and shelter themselves under their sides, by which means they were able both to guard themselves and to annoy the enemy, who were not aware of any such mode of attack. George Castriot, a valiant knight, was also there, accompanied and surrounded by the soldiers and youth of Croia, having so disposed them that he might be able to encourage them by his example and to witness their conduct. Footnote: I cannot understand the precise place assigned by Lavardin to these troops. Footnote end. After the squadron of archers followed the main body of the infantry, composed of bands armed with pikes and targets, led on by Aydin, the brother of Nimesak. Uranocontes, a sage and experienced warrior, commanded the rest of the horse with the rearward and reserve. This was a strong and close battalion, composed of the flower of the old soldiers, holding themselves firm, like a bulwark, for the support of the other troops. When Scandabeg had thus marshalled his army, he would not permit the trumpet to give the signal for battle until he saw the Pasha ready and advancing to the fight. He feared lest the impetuosity of his men should cause them to rush forward and break their ranks, and thus fall into confusion. The Turkish commander, looking upon the arrangement of the Christian forces, advanced, uttering contemptuous speeches. "Ever, ever," said he, "do the greater devour the less." And he laughed outright at what he called the foolish pomp of the Christians, marching so formally and foolishly, as he thought, to their own funeral. One of the Ottoman legions came forward boldly before the others, but being speedily and closely charged by the forlorn hope of the Christians, they suddenly gave way and retreated quickly within their trenches. But the Prince of Albania, suspecting some Turkish stratagem, sent forward a body of horsemen to stay the furious pursuit of his own soldiers, and to bring every man back into his place. The same thing occurred in the left wing, and, when all were again in their places, they prepared themselves for a general engagement. When the fight began, the wings were fiercely led on by Tanusi and Moses, and Castriot, with like fury pricking forward cheerfully with his cavalry, assailed the battalion of the enemy, which he had selected. The ambush also broke forth from the woods with loud cries and shouts before the forces of the Pasha had all joined battle, whereupon many companies of the Turks, particularly those in the rearward, betook themselves to flight, and thus, the front ranks being hemmed in by the wings of the Christian army, were exposed to be slaughtered by the centre legion. One battalion of the enemy for a long time kept the event of the engagement doubtful. This battalion was composed of the flower of the army, and, as was afterwards known, surrounded the general Ali Pasha. Aydin, who commanded the main body of infantry, having charged the Turkish centre, was met by a determined resistance on the part of the enemy, who continued to pour in new forces until Uranocontes, with the reserve, fresh and in high spirits, fell upon them and decided the battle. Few of the enemy in this part of the conflict escaped the swords of the Christians, except 300, who, begging for quarter and casting away their arms, were spared by order of the Christian prince. The troops, after their success and worthy exploits, came with loud acclamations into the presence of their commander, where they found all things as they could wish, for the Croyans had entirely broken the battalion of the Pasha, and, after a dreadful slaughter, they pursued the Turkish commander, who saved himself with the relics of his army. The fight continued from sunrise until 9 o'clock, the third hour. 24 ensigns of the Turks were taken, 2,000 of the enemy made prisoners, and 22,000 slain. The loss of the Christians was very small. It is said there were missing but about 120, though the number of the wounded was much greater. In this severe battle, nothing was omitted or overlooked on the part of the Christians that might tend to victory. With regard to both officers and soldiers, it has been affirmed that lions were led on by lions. Many of them were old soldiers who had borne arms under the father of Scandabeg, and appeared to be masters in the art of war. Scandabeg remained quiet in his camp the remainder of that day and the following night. The next morning, elated with the success of his arms, he prepared to make an incursion into the territories of the enemy. Having joyfully addressed his troops, he directed that the foot soldiers should mount the horses that were taken from the enemy, and that all should serve on horseback as men-at-arms, and he invited every man under the favour of the great God to follow him cheerfully and reap the fruits of their valour. The soldiers most gladly accepted this invitation, and, through contempt of the enemy, were for hurrying on without order or precaution. But the prince, not trusting the fickleness of fortune, restrained the eagerness of his men until such a time as the scouts whom he had sent out brought him word that there was no danger. Great was the booty which they obtained. Men and cattle were driven away, and nothing spared but the women and children. Even the wounded soldiers took part in the pillage, and so abundant was the spoil that the men seemed more grieved at what they were obliged to leave behind them than rejoiced at what they could carry away. At length Castriot ordered a retreat to be sounded, and his men retired, overloaded with booty. The captains made themselves merry with the common soldiers, calling them sheep-stealers and shepherds, and asking what Ali Pasha, if he were now to see them, would say to his soldiers for having been conquered by such a set of fellows. Thus the soldiers, with mirth and merriment, and joyful songs, dragged on their loads, until, with loud cries, they saluted the guards of their camp, who joined, and marched on before them. Having passed the following night in camp, Scandabeg the next morning ordered the baggage to be trussed up, and, with his host, marched on triumphant towards Croia. The multitudes which encountered them on their way saluted them as valiant and triumphant, and wondered at the spoil taken from the enemy. The newly made men-at-arms could scarcely be distinguished from the old. These congratulations and rejoicings continued many days. Letters crowned with laurel were sent to the princes and lords of Epire, together with some of the standards taken in battle, the remainder of which were hung up in the churches. After the defeat of the Turks under Castriots at the Battle of Morava, and this victory obtained by Scandabeg over Ali Pasha, the Christians of Hungary and Poland, aided by Pope Eugenius and Philip, Duke of Burgundy, deemed the time favourable for an attack upon the power of the Turks, with the view of rescuing Christendom from their dominion. A letter was accordingly addressed to Scandabeg by Ulaszlo, King of Hungary and Poland, in the following terms. Ulaszlo, King of Hungary and Polonia, and to the noble Scandabeg, Prince of Epirus, greeting. It may be that some good hap hath deferred this our late congratulation until this present, to the intent we might at this time, together with you, rejoice in the double success of your prosperity. First, for the happy recovery of your estate, and then for that the same hath, by your wisdom and valour, of late been so notably defended. Wherefore in this we rejoice, not only in your behalf, but in the behalf of all good Christians, that it hath pleased God in his goodness, by your valour, to have given so great an increase and comfort unto the Christian commonwealth. Forasmuch as amongst others our great evils, the loss of the Albanian people hath not been to be accounted the least, at such time as John Castriot, a worthy prince your father, oppressed by Amurath, and by the ungrateful destinies taken out of this world, had neither the means to leave unto you his kingdom and sceptre, as unto his son, then living in his enemy's power, neither was able yet otherwise to provide for his affairs. And would to God this your father, most happy in such a son, might have till now lived, whose felicity had in that surmounted all others, if he might have seen you before his death. For, as you seem unto me above all other princes in the world, without offence be it said, most accomplished with all the good graces and perfections of both body and mind, so you are endowed with a certain divine and wonderful fortune, under the good conduct whereof not only the whole kingdom of Epirus may think itself
insecurity, but all the rest of the other nations also. Lately, by the detestable fraud and violence of the Ottoman kings dismembered from the realm of Macedon, may also recover the former beauty of their ancient laws and liberties. For, to say nothing of those things which, even from your childhood, having continually made you envied, have heretofore purchased unto you an immortal fame and glory, even amongst the barbarians themselves. What can be more glorious than this victory which, as we have heard and believe, you, to your singular admiration, have obtained by the overthrow and utter discomfiture of Ali's Pasha, with its so great and mighty a power? But now, O Scandabeg, God so appointing it, who, in his deep and secret wisdom, hath reserved you unto these dangerous times, for the public good and comfort of the Christian commonwealth, there offers itself unto you an object of far greater glory, with a fair and fit occasion for you to revenge yourself of all the wrongs and injuries, both new and old, by Amurath, the Turkish Sultan, done not in private to the person of yourself only, but unto the whole state and kingdom of Epirus also, and not the domestical and civil miseries of your country only, but the public calamities also, and those opprobrious disgraces done against the Christian faith and religion in general, now oppressed, I will not say extinguished. And that is, if you, with your victorious forces, will succour us in this extremity of our affairs, not yet altogether desperate. Hereunto the old princes of Hungary and Polonia, and all other men of courage, invite you. Julian, the Cardinal of Sant Angel, entreateth you, with all those devout and courageous Christians, which long since here with us, and ready in arms, wish for nothing more than the presence of your victorious ensigns, which so fair an occasion by God himself now offered, if you refuse not, will, in all men's judgment, be a sure mean to vanquish and overthrow our common enemy, the Turk, and to drive him quite out of Europe, wrongfully by him of so long time possessed. I need not, therefore, as I suppose, to use any kind of persuasion unto you in this cause and quarrel, the defence whereof doth purchase unto us health, light, and liberty. But being neglected, I fear and abhor to forebode what may ensue thereof. We Christians have been too slack and backward in helping one another. The flame hath now well near consumed us all, whilst no man thought it would have come near himself. What do we see of the Greek Empire? What of the Bulgarians and Servians? Ye, mine own losses and many calamities already, and yet also to be endured, who is able to recount? The brave and most valiant princes, the surest bulwarks and defences of the kingdom of Hungary, from time to time lost, and the puissant armies, with one and the same fatal chance of war, consumed and brought to nothing. Who is able to reckon up? Insomuch that there is no house, no wife, no matron in all of Hungary, which is not in some measure partaker of this heaviness. All this do the Christian princes hear of, and yet the miserable estate and condition of their allies can nothing move any one of them, but suffer us thus, as a sacrifice for the rest, to be on all parts exposed to the rage and fury of the common and merciless enemy. Only Eugenius, the most holy Bishop of Rome, and Philip, Duke of Burgundy, have not refused to bear a part of the burden of this our afflicted fortune. The one has sent hither his legate Julian, the cardinal, with notable and puissant succours, and the other with his fleet at sea, and come as far as Hellespontus, so much as in him lieth, doth notably hinder the Turks' passage into Europe. And one other hope there is, not now far from us, and that is your help, whereof we are so desirous, which we require of you, moved thereunto partly by your valour so well known, and partly in regard of the imminent peril and common danger of us all. And albeit we are not ignorant how evil you may be at leisure to take such an expedition in hand, for the late troubled estate of your affairs, and your new recovered kingdom, as yet scarcely established, yet notwithstanding, let it not withhold you, or keep you back, assuring you that as this expedition cannot be but unto you most honourable, even so this your present desert shall not be bestowed upon ungrateful and thankless men, but that which you shall now first begin and undertake for our preservation and dignity, we will from henceforth and ever continue for your glory, and for the increase of your greatness. Fare you well, from our regal city of Buda, the 4th of July, 1444.
Textual note. Lavardin says 1443. Textual note end. Ali Pasha had by this time returned with the remains of his defeated army to Amurath, who was already acquainted with the disaster which had befallen the forces sent into Epire. The Pasha excused himself to the Sultan in the best manner that he could, calling his soldiers to witness that he had omitted nothing which became a good general, and that he had been wanting in nothing towards them, nor they towards him, but that the defeat should be attributed to the fortune of war. He entreated Amurath to make another attempt, assuring him that he would pursue measures which should change the fortune of Scandabeg. To this counsel of Ali Pasha the Sultan was inclined to listen, but other counsellors, particularly Kali Pasha, persuaded him that while the attack on Epire might with safety be deferred, the affairs of Hungary required his immediate attention. The letter of the King of Hungary appeared to Scandabeg so just and reasonable that he felt fully disposed to lend the aid required of him. He would not, however, act without the advice of those who, on all occasions, acted with him. Accordingly, his chieftains being called together, the letter of Olaszlo was read in full council. There was no one present who did not approve of the measure proposed, through fear of the increasing greatness of the Ottoman power, the most effectual check to which appeared to be the valour and fortune of the Hungarians, whose downfall before Amurath would lead to universal desolation, and because it was deemed of the utmost importance to secure the friendship and alliance of so great a king. Wherefore it was determined unanimously that succours should be sent to him. But there was a great diversity of opinion as to the number of forces which should be sent, and whether it was expedient that Scandabeg should in person lead his army abroad, or remain and take care of his own dominions. Although the mind of the prince was decided upon this subject, and remained unaltered, he was unwilling to use his influence one way or the other, and he remained silent. At length an end was made of the discussion by the vehement earnestness of Prince Paul Dukagin, who addressed to them a speech, in which he freely declared that he was most inclined not to send any succours at all, but that they should bend all their force and attention to the defence and preservation of their own country. He, however, maintained that it would be altogether vain and improper, if they did take part in the Hungarian war, not to send an efficient force.
"Shall Scandabeg,"
said he,
"be so meanly accompanied into the midst of the Varnian fields, where all men in general do attend and wish for him? Shall so many princes and great lords of Hungary and of the Christian army see your chief and sovereign, whose glorious renown is now dispersed and gone into all parts before him, shall he, I say, be seen marching before a handful of men, no otherwise than as one accompanied with so many thieves and robbers.
With regard to the question whether Scandabeg should remain at home, or lead his forces in person, he exclaimed,
"What? Shall we send these triumphant succours unto the Hungarians without Scandabeg, whose only name will yield them more succour than if all of us were with them, and he absent, whom they especially do invite, and whom all of them do demand and seek after? As touching Scandabeg, there is not any one of you but will confess that it is more easy for you to find a man to govern you in peace and to administer justice than to conduct and lead soldiers marching with their arms. But to the intent you may not think that in this discourse I bring you nothing but great and glorious words. Behold, here I am, who do offer myself with 5,000 men to the war of Hungary, and, if need be, do vow and consecrate my life for the service of Jesus Christ, principally, and next for the glory and reputation of you all, and for Scandabeg, his honour, name, and dignity."
To use the words and orthography of Lavardin's translator, this round and sharp oration of Dukagin, and the liberal offer of his pains and labour, together with the great authority which the man had with all the princes of Epire, and with Scandabeg especially, did soon work a change and alteration in their minds and opinions. Scandabeg himself was the first that approved his devise, and after he had recounted and numbered up his merits, and worthy acts in the whole course of his life before past, he said that there was not any one besides him in all the company that had spoken rightly, and for the reputation of them in general. And he did oftentimes repeat it, that most happy and fortunate should the estate of Albany be, if it had many such men of like devotion. This Paul, as we have said, was one of the most puissant and noblest princes of Epire, and amongst other his virtuous conditions, he was most singularly commended for a certain true, unfeigned, and perfect zeal in religion, and was held in high accompt and the estimate amongst all men, being descended out of that honourable family, from which very many most famous and warlike captains had been descended, and especially Nicholas, son of the said Paul, who far surpassed and excelled all his forefathers and ancestors in the honour and renown of arms. Of this man there is yet at this day extant and remaining in Penaripol, a town of Thrace by the inhabitants called Persera, a notable monument or mark of his excellent virtue, and of the strength of his arm, if I may so term it, immortal. And that is the relics or pieces of an enemy's target, the which in a certain fight of late, whereof the memory is yet but new and fresh, he did with one only blow of his scimitary cut quite in sunder from one side thereof to the other, that the hand of the barbarian holding it then in fight was so maimed as from thenceforward he was never able to use it any more in the wars. The whole command and ordering of the expedition was committed to Scandabeg, who, before he commenced the levy of his forces, dispatched the Hungarian messenger with the following letter: Scandabeg, Prince of the Epirots, unto you Laszlo, King of Hungary and Polonia, greeting. Your letters, most invincible King, I have with joy and contentment received, which I, in the general assembly of my chieftains, having caused publicly to be read, there was not any one of them which was not of the opinion but that so just an occasion of war by you offered was forthwith to be joyfully, on our behalf, also embraced. And so every man doth both publicly and privately affirm that nothing could have happened unto them more acceptable from God than that they might, by some notable service, testify their grateful minds, and bind unto them so excellent a prince, as also to give so fit succours unto the Christian commonwealth. In which forwardness of my people, I myself took great contentment and pleasure both in regard of yourself and in the behalf of the public and common cause, seeing my men of war and all my other subjects, of what state or degree soever, without any persuasion used on my part, to be so cheerfully and courageously minded in the defence of the faith and of the Christian religion, and so well affectioned to your most royal majesty. And to say the truth, who is he, if he be not hateful unto God and man, albeit there were no question of religion, or of the common danger, that would refuse so just and lawful a war? For such a king, as unto whom alone we may and ought to attribute that we Christians do not only reign, but even live, breathe, and enjoy the liberty of our speech, who would not willingly take up arms and adventure himself into the most manifest and certain danger for the people of Hungary, by whom in all ages the Christian commonwealth hath, with their so many travels and so much of their blood, been so mightily supported and defended, who even from the very cradle have been the continual enemies of our enemies, and have, as it were, even vowed themselves for the honour of the Christian religion and name. Would God, most mighty and redoubted Uleslo, it had been in my power to have brought unto you such forces to this honourable war as were answerable to my courage and desire. Then happily Europe should no longer lie in this ignominious estate, oppressed by Amurath. Neither should the fields of Varna or Basilia so often smoke with the blood of Hungarians, nor every corner of Macedonia with the blood of Epirotes, both nations being, as it were, become the expiatory sacrifices of others' sins and offences. We all now by turns perish, whilst every man thinketh himself born but for himself alone. But why do I unto myself pour forth these vain complaints? Truly, it neither repenteth me of my forces, as I suppose, if it shall please God, that our forces might once meet and join together in so happy a war. Neither shall the Christian commonwealth have any cause to sorrow, or be aggrieved with the issue and event of our fortune. For unto those 15,000 good soldiers which lately discomfited Alice Pasha on the borders of Macedonia, my purpose is to join as many more unto them, with all which strength, as soon as conveniently they may, I will begin to set forward, ready to follow your ensigns to all events whatsoever. And so fare you well, from Croya, the 3rd of August, 1444. Textual note. Lavardin says 1443. Textual note end. When Scandabeg had sent this letter to the King of Hungary, he turned all his attention to the levying of forces. The troops which had served against Hali Pasha he reinforced with new supplies, and ordered them all to the war. He soon raised and enrolled 10,000 more. Paul Dukagin, in conformity with the offer made by him, presented himself among the foremost, with 5,000 chosen men singularly well appointed. Whereupon the domestic affairs of the province were set in order, and its wants provided for. Scandabeg reviewed his whole army, arranged it, and appointed officers to several corps. Public prayers were then offered up, and never did the people of Epire, who were always more inclined to arms than to religion, so importune the divine majesty with their prayers and supplications as they did at that time for the happy return of their soldiers, who were then to march out of their own country. All things, both human and divine, having thus been attended to, the army began its march. With great alacrity they had advanced their ensigns as far as the borders of Mysia, when their progress was checked by the refusal of George Brankovic, commonly called the despot of Servia, to suffer them to pass through his territories. This man was advanced in years, and without religion, making a mock of both the Christian and Mohammedan faith. He was inclined to favour the Turks, on account of the marriage of his daughter, Kathagosina, with Amurath, and because of his hatred of the Hungarians, especially against Janos Hunyadi, the despot of Transylvania, who was in possession of certain towns and places of Vervia, which he claimed for himself. Upon the approach of Scandabeg to the borders of his territory, he caused all the passes to be guarded, so as to prevent the entrance of the Albanian army. Ambassadors were dispatched by Scandabeg to remonstrate with the despot and to threaten force if he refused to grant a passage through his country. But he remained deaf to the entreaties and threats of Scandabeg, who, greatly against his inclination, and with a full conviction of the dangers and difficulties to which he should be exposed, resolved to put his threats into execution. But although he might doubtless have forced his way through the despot's territories, yet, during the delay occasioned by this unfriendly conduct of Brankovic, events occurred which rendered the good intention of the Epirotes towards the Hungarians vain and fruitless. Ulaszlo and his army, having marched through Wallachia and passed over the Danube, came to Varna, with the intention to unite their forces with those which were at sea, and thence pass into Romania. Footnote: the country of Varna is a champaign valley, beyond the confines of Mysia, upon the sea called Maggiore, 4 days' journey from Adrianople, between two promontories, upon one of which is seated Galata, on the other Macropolis. On the left of the valley where Galata stands is a large marsh. Footnote end. Amurath, being made acquainted with these movements of the Hungarians, was not at all dismayed, but having quickly repulsed the Caramanian and secured the country of Natolia, his only trouble and difficulty was how to transport his troops into Europe, as the sea was commanded by the fleet of the Bishop of Rome and the Duke of Burgundy. From which embarrassment, it is related, he was delivered by certain Genoese merchants upon the promise of a very great reward, it being stipulated that the army of the Turks should be transported across the Hellespont at the rate of a ducat for each man. The number of men thus transported was estimated at about 100,000, all Asiatics, as Amurath distrusted the faith of his European subjects. When his army had all passed the strait, he advanced with such rapidity that in less than 7 days he pitched his tents within 4 miles of the camp of the Christians, near to the city of Varna, by the ancients named Dionysiopolis. Upon the approach of the Turkish army, it was resolved by the Christians to hazard the event of a battle. The supreme command of the army was committed to Hunyadi, in the ordering of which he exerted and made proof of the skill and experience which he possessed in military affairs. As the description of this battle does not properly belong to the life of Scandabeg, suffice it to say that, through the imprudent valour and impetuosity of King Ulaszlo, in spite of the remonstrances of Hunyadi, the former was slain, and the latter taken prisoner by the despot of Servia, and by him put in irons and kept prisoner until the towns claimed by him were delivered up, and the Christian army was dispersed. This battle was fought on the feast of St. Martin's, the 11th of November, in the year 1443. Footnote: this shows the dates of the above letters of Ulaszlo and Scandabeg. Footnote end. The news of this defeat being conveyed to Scandabeg, while he was yet upon the borders of Servia, caused him great grief and mortification. But that the conduct of the despot might not go unpunished, he broke into the country, and wasted it with fire and sword. Upon his return towards Epire, he gathered up many of the remains of the broken forces of the Hungarians, and, having supplied them with money and provisions, he also furnished them with vessels to convey them to Ragusa, whence they returned to their own homes. It would be rash, perhaps, to pronounce a judgment upon the conduct of Scandabeg in this expedition, without the means of better information than can be obtained at this distance of time. But from all that can be learned, it would seem as if his usual prudence and foresight were not manifested in his setting out with so large an armament, and on so important an expedition, without having secured beforehand a free and open way for the march of his army. 1444. Amurath did not reap much advantage from the overthrow of the Hungarians, which has just been related, insomuch that his courage seems rather abated than increased by the victory obtained at Varna. His losses were so great as to deter him from immediately engaging again in active war. But this disposition to rest was disturbed by the accounts which came from the despot of Servia, and from the frontiers of Macedonia,
The forces of Scandabeg were reported to have committed such ravages and to have carried off such an amount of spoil as to inflame anew the anger and resentment of the Turks. The despot in particular was most urgent with Amurath to come to his protection against the hatred of the Hungarians and the incursions of the Epirots, whose resentment he had drawn upon himself by refusing to afford Scandabeg a free passage through his territories. These representations made to Amurath had great weight with him and with his people, and it was resolved to make war upon Scandabeg. But, as Amurath had not been unsuccessful in his attempts upon others by means of artifice and deceit, he thought fit, before having recourse to war, to employ the same methods in regard to Scandabeg. He accordingly addressed to him a letter in the terms following: Amurath Ottoman, King of the Turks and Emperor of the East, to the most ingrateful Scandabeg, wisheth neither health nor welfare. I never wanted honourable preferments to bestow upon thee, all the while thou didst live in my court, of all others most unkind Scandabeg, but now I want words wherewith to speak unto thee. Thou hast so highly offended my mind, and touched mine honour, that I know not in discretion what words to use unto thee, but of late one of my domestical servants. For neither will hard speech mollify the natural fierceness of thy proud disposition, neither art thou worthy of better, which hast far exceeded all hostility. And because thou wouldest omit no occasion to provoke me, hast of late proceeded to that point of folly, that thou hast had thine own affairs and the welfare of thine own subjects in small regard, by confederating thyself in arms with the Hungarians against me. It grieveth me to rehearse other thy unkindness, and as it were to touch those sores, if my mind would ever suffer me to forget the same, or that thine so manifold and horrible treasons, and the strange examples of a most unthankful mind, were to be covered with silence. Yet I thought good to advertise thee, although perhaps too late, lest that thy unstayed heat do untimely overthrow thee with thy unlucky kingdom. And then thou wouldst make humble confession of thy long transgression, when thou hast lost thyself, and left no hope of refuge in thy desperate estate. We have hitherto sufficiently suffered thy manifold injuries. Thou hast sufficiently provoked the majesty of the Ottoman Empire with wrong and contumelious despite, and I with patience have borne all these thy contempts. Thinkest thou that my army, by thee betrayed unto the Hungarians, shall be unrevenged? Thinkest thou that so many cities and towns in Epirus, by thee rent from the body of my empire, with my garrisons there slain, shall be forgotten? Or thinkest thou with thy late committed outrages to escape my revenging hand? Remember the destruction of mine army under Alice Pasha, the wasting and burning of my dominions, and lately the Hungarian wars, by thee, so far as in thee was, countenanced, with the territories of George, the despot of Servia, my father-in-law, by thee spoiled. At length amend, thou graceless man, and expect not further whether my indignation will break out. Let not these trifling allurements of thy good fortune so puff up thy foolish desires and sharpen thy conceits, that thy miserable fortunes afterwards may move even thy greatest enemies, or myself, to compassion. I would thou shouldest at length remember my courtesies, if any spark of humanity remains in thy savage nature, and make me not longer sorry that I have so evil bestowed the same. And although it is not the part of an honourable mind to rehearse those things which we have in bounty bestowed upon any man, yet it is the token of a most unthankful nature to so easily forget all kindness past, as to need to be put in remembrance thereof. Wherefore, Scandabeg, I cannot bewail thy hap, and lament thine estate. For to let pass the health of thy soul, which thou, a very reprobate, esteemeth as nothing, not to speak of the laws of Mahomet by thee despised, and the holy prophet by thee contemned, for the zeal thou hast unto the Christian superstition. What hast thou, which now holdeth thy poor and base kingdom in such price, ever wanted at my hands of all those things which most delight the desires of men? Didst thou ever want armour, horses, a great train of followers and servants, money or other superfluities, the allurements of all ages? Or didst thou want matter to exercise thy valour for the increase of thine honour? Wast thou ever denied preferments, dignities, and honours of all sorts to fit thine age, both at home and abroad? Was any man in my court dearer unto me than thyself? What growing wit, not of strangers only, but of them that were nearest unto myself, was better welcome unto me than thine? With what careful instruction did I cause thee to be brought up? When thou wast delivered unto me almost a child, I daily cherished and increased thy hoped towardliness. With learning and nurture, I have at all times honoured thee with rich rewards, magnifical praises, and honours of the field, which of all things is most glorious. So that in all feats of arms no soldier was to me better known, or captain of me more honoured. For all these great benefits, Scandabeg, thou now showest thyself such an one, that I may be thought not to have brought up such a man as I hoped for, but a very serpent in mine one bosom. But the love of thy country did move thee, which if thou hadst asked of me, would I have denied the same unto thee? Which, if thou dost well remember, I so oftentimes voluntarily proffered unto thee. But thou hadst to gain the same by treachery, than to receive it at my hands of courtesy. So thine be it, therefore, on God his name, and that with my very good will. And verily, according to my accustomed clemency towards all them whom I have once known, and been familiarly acquainted with, I now pardon thee all thou hast offended me, not for any thy present deserts, which are none, but because in this public enmity it pleaseth me to remember my former kindness in private towards thee, and thy faithfulness sometimes in my affairs. Especially for that time was much longer wherein thou servest me than the time wherein thou hast offended me. Croia and thy father's kingdom, although thou hast gained the same by foul treachery, I give unto thee, upon condition thou willingly restore unto me the other towns of Epirus, which by no right belong unto thee, but are mine by law of arms, by myself honourably won. Whatsoever thou hast taken from my father-in-law, the Prince of Servia, thou shalt forthwith restore, and make him an honourable recompense for the other harms thou hast done unto him. And for ever hereafter thou shalt as well forbear to offer violence to any our friends, as aid to any our enemies. So shalt thou for ever avoid the displeasure of the Turks, and stand in my good grace and favour, as thou hast done before, except thou hadst rather, being taught by thine own harms, then in vain cry for mercy when the furious outrage shall have me in person, an implacable revenger. Thou knowest thy forces, thou knowest the strength of mine arms. Thou hast before thine eyes the fresh example of the Hungarian fortune, so thou needest no further admonitions. Yet I would thou shouldest write at length what thou intendest to do. Thou mayest also confer with Aradin, our servant, our trusty and faithful messenger, of whom thou shalt understand more than are in these letters comprised. Farewell, if thou be wise. From Hadrianople.
Many Epirots were of the opinion that it would be best for their prince to hearken to the proposals of Amurath, but Scandabeg was of a different mind. And after he had expressed his sentiments, and set forth his reasons, they all cheerfully acquiesced in his opinion. Whereupon he discoursed much with the Turkish ambassador, sometimes privately and sometimes in full council, setting forth the causes of complaint which he had against Amurath. And having courteously entertained the ambassador 5 days, with a cheerful countenance and an unembarrassed manner, lest, being a spy, he should have to report any symptoms of fear among the Christians, and having shown him all the fortifications and disposition of his camp, Scandabeg dismissed him with the following answer in writing to Amurath. The soldier of Christ Jesus, George Castriot, surnamed Scandabeg, Prince of Epirus, to Amurath Ottoman, King of the Turks, sendeth greeting. Thou hast in times past, as thou writest me, exceeded me in many kinds of courtesies, and at this present I will exceed thee in modest and temperate speech. For I think there is no greater token of a base mind than not to be able to forbear to give railings and opprobrious words, even unto our most mortal enemies. Wherefore we have with patience received and seen both thy letters and messenger, and to confess a truth, they have ministered unto me greater occasion of smile than choler. Whilst at first thou shamest not to accuse me of much ingratitude and treason, and presently following a milder passion, seemest careful of my soul's health, being ignorant of thine own estate, as a studious defender of a most damnable error. And at last, keeping neither law of arms, nor orderly course answering to our affairs, dost most insolently and unadvisedly, as a valiant conqueror to his vanquished enemy, propound many conditions of peace, of such quality and condition that mine ears scorn to hear the same. Truly, Amurath, although thy immoderate railing might move a man of greatest patience to intemperate speech, yet I impute the same partly to thy great age, and partly to the waywardness of thy nature, and the rest to thy conceived grief, which I know thou canst hardly moderate, and the rather for that I have not set down myself to contend with thee in foul and unseemly language, but with arms, and the just fury of war. Yet I pray thee, wherefore dost thou so exclaim against me before God and man? As though thou hadst first suffered wrong and injury from me, and that thou hadst not in truth first done the same. Dost thou call my necessary departing a perfidious treachery? My native country by my policy and valour recovered, dost thou object to me as a villainy? Object the same still, and spare not. Charge me with such crimes forever. I care not. The long catalogue of thy kindness towards me, which thou rehearsest, I could willingly remember, if it drew not with it the woeful remembrance of my greater miseries, which, if they were to be compared together, the greatness of thy good deserts would be overwhelmed with the multitude of thy greater tyrannies, which I had rather thou shouldst count with thyself than blush while I repeat them. Every man that knoweth them may marvel how I had the power to endure them, or that thou wast not weary at last of thy cruelty and secret hatred. Thou tookest away my father's kingdom by force, thou didst murder my brethren, and myself thou didst most wickedly vow to death, when I little feared any such cruelty. And doth it now seem strange to thee, O Amurath, that an invincible mind desirous of liberty should seek to break out of the bonds of so great and insolent slavery? How long at length didst thou think I would endure thy proud bondage? Which, for all that, I many years endured, and refused not thy command. I exposed myself to public and private dangers, both voluntarily, and by thy designment. Speeches were given out daily by thyself,
and the admonition of my friends concerning thy deep treachery was rife in my ears. Yet for all that, of a long time I simply believed both thy words and deeds to have been devoid of all fraud, until thy cankered malice began too apparently to shew itself. Then I began also to gloose with thee, wholly metamorphosed into thine own conceits, until I found occasion to recover my liberty. Wherefore there is no cause thou shouldst now grieve, if thou be well beaten with thine own rod. But these are but trifles, Amurath, in comparison of those things which I have laid up in hope and resolution of mind. Therefore hereafter surcease thine angry threats, and tell us not of the Hungarian fortune. Every man hath his own resolution, and every man a particular governor of his actions. And so will we with patience endure such fortune as it shall please God to appoint us. In meantime, for the direction of our affairs, we will not request the counsel of our enemies, nor peace of thee, but victory by the help of God. Farewell, from our camp. When the Turk perused the letter of Scandabeg, and learned from Muraden, the ambassador, the conversations which he had held with the Albanian prince, he was moved to fear more than to anger by the great confidence and hopeful spirit of the man, which he knew did not rest upon a false foundation, and he felt a presentiment awakened in him of the difficulties which he should have to encounter in the Albanian war. That he might not, however, betray to his people his inward sentiments, it is reported that, smiling and stroking his beard, he would exclaim, "Thou dost covet, unhappy wretch. Thou dost covet some memorable and distinguished kind of death, and thou shalt have it. Believe me, thou shalt have it. We ourselves will see thy obsequies performed, and without waiting thy commands, most mighty king of the Albanians, we will honour and grace thy funeral with our presence, lest that hereafter, being in hell, thou do complain that thy end was ignoble and dishonourable." Notwithstanding these bravadoes, the thoughts of the Sultan, in the midst of his difficulties, were very uncertain and irresolute. But being informed that Scandabeg kept the field with his horsemen only, and that he had dismissed the rest of his army, he sent Ferisay, one of his pashas, a man of an active and fierce disposition, with 9,000 horse, all chosen and picked troops, to make a sudden incursion into Epire, with the hope of taking Scandabeg by surprise. He was directed by the Sultan to use secrecy and dispatch, and was promised great rewards in the case of success. He accordingly, with great secrecy, entered upon the frontiers of Macedonia, and standing carefully upon his guard, he advanced more like a marauder than in the manner of an open and honourable warrior. Notwithstanding all his care, Scandabeg was made acquainted with his approach, and prepared to encounter him. The Albanian prince took possession of a straight and narrow valley, named Makriya, through which it was necessary for the Turkish force to pass, and filled it with hardy and resolute soldiers. The approach of the Pasha was indicated by clouds of dust, raised by the trampling of his horses. The Albanians remained quiet until they perceived the enemy entered into the valleys, and environed by high and craggy rocks full of woods, and entangled on all sides in the dense forests, then suddenly issuing out, they fell upon them with great violence and impetuosity. The troops of Scandabeg amounted to 1,500 foot soldiers and 2,000 horse, the latter of whom were reserved for a subsequent service. The Turks, entangled in the difficulties of the pass, were assailed on every quarter by the infantry, who slew them at their pleasure. The horses of the Turks were rather a disadvantage than a service to their riders. They, however, forsook not their ranks, nor quitted the place in which they were attacked, but defended themselves with great bravery as long as there was any hope of success, and even when all hope of escape was taken from them, they almost all continued to fight valiantly to the last. Only a few begged for quarter, which was granted them. 760 prisoners were taken. The number of the slain was much greater. Ferisay, seeing his advanced guard enclosed, and surprised at the mercy of their enemies, whose number he supposed to be greater than it really was, retreated with the rest of his troops. As he retired, he cried aloud that it was more commendable in an expert commander to preserve some of his forces than to expose all in a situation
where they were liable to be slaughtered like dumb beasts. It is true that some represent him to have been slain in the fight by the hands of Scandabeg. The Albanian cavalry did not suffer the retreat of the Turks without molestation, for keeping close upon their rear, they slew many loiterers and stragglers, nor did they desist until restrained by weariness. The Turks being thus put to flight, without any great loss on the part of the Albanians, Scandabeg, with the troops which he had about him, invaded the territory of the enemy, and gratified his soldiers by an abundant booty. The troubles which threatened the Ottoman Empire on the part of the Hungarians prevented Amurath from attempting to wreak such vengeance as he wished upon the Albanians. But, not to let the slaughter of his troops under Ferisay go unrevenged, he committed to Mustafa the care of filling up the broken companies of Ferisay, and of increasing those forces with 6,000 horse. This whole armament was placed under his command, and he was strictly enjoined to avoid, with the utmost care, falling into any ambush or coming to action with the enemy, but to content himself with laying waste to the country with fire and sword. These directions were implicitly followed by Mustafa. As soon as he entered upon Christian territory, he sent forward 300 horsemen to scour the country and reconnoitre the places where any danger of ambush might appear, and in case of need they were ordered to retreat immediately to the main body, or if the occasion should offer, to entice the enemy from their lurking places and draw them within reach of the main army. When these scouts had carefully examined the country round, and reported on their return that no danger existed, the Turkish commander, retaining 4,000 horse, formed an entrenched camp for them, situated upon a rising ground. Some of his men he disposed as secret sentinels and watchmen upon the summits of several high hills, who, by certain signals, were to give warning of the approach of the enemy. Having made these arrangements, he gave license to the rest of his horsemen to spoil the country, in consequence of which havoc and slaughter were widely spread around. His orders were that whoever did not retire into the camp upon the first sound of the trumpet for retreat should be accounted an enemy. That pleasant country was laid waste, the trees and plants rooted up, the meadows and pastures, to use the words of Lavardin, seemed to bewail and lament. The flames of the towns and villages were seen on all sides. The corn was trampled underfoot by the horses, for the season was autumn, and the husbandmen saw the prospect of losing the rewards of their labour. The men and women, however, for the most part, had retired into the walled towns and strongholds, taking with them their families and most valuable effects. While the Turks were thus employed, Scandabeg, although it was somewhat late before he received the advice of the Turkish invasion, arrived at the Valley of Makriya with 4,000 horse and 1,000 foot, and his soldiers entered with great joy into that place so well known to them, and which was still moist with the blood of their enemies. As Scandabeg was reflecting upon the course he should pursue, and the men were examining the places which they had before occupied, a certain Epirot, just escaped from the Turks and covered with blood and recent wounds, came and threw himself at the feet of Scandabeg, imploring his protection. He then, with a bold countenance, encouraged and excited his countrymen, telling them that the fields were desolate, all things having been turned upside down by the Turks, who, scattered abroad, dreamed of nothing but prey and booty, and that they might easily, and without great danger, be surprised and made to render an account of their unadvised undertaking. Castriot, at first encouraged by this report, but, after having more particularly inquired into the state of things, as to how their camp was situated, and what were the movements of the enemy, he applauded Mustafa, and commended his prudence. He judged that it would be necessary for him, in future, to be very cautious and circumspect in his movements. Whereupon he called his army about him, and standing in the midst, so as to be heard by all, he addressed them to this effect: "I have been wont, my fellow soldiers and companions in arms, to give advice and orders in the conduct of our affairs, but it now appears proper
that we should consult together respecting the course we ought to pursue in our present circumstances. We were at first given to understand that the Turks, like robbers and freebooters, without any order or conduct, were wandering up and down the fields, flying hither and thither like men totally unapprehensive of our approach. For this reason you have, by my persuasion and means, and under my conduct, come, intending to surprise and attack them with your forces. But I need not remind you that new counsels are rendered necessary for us by the fortunate coming of this man. You have yourselves heard him recount what our enemies are doing, and how they conduct themselves. From the manner in which Mustafa has placed and ordered his camp, and the care with which he has fortified and guarded it, you may be assured that his conduct is not that of a robber, as we were led to suppose, but of a wary and well-advised enemy, for which reason, in my opinion, it behooves you to use more caution and deliberation towards your enemies than you seem hitherto to have supposed necessary. Let us not meddle with those who are abroad foraging, lest by doing so we afford the advantage eagerly desired by the Turkish general of issuing forth from his entrenchments and obtaining an easy victory over us. For it is to be feared that while we are dispersed and out of order, thinking to pursue those who are scattered over the country, we may be enclosed and cut to pieces. It is better that we issue forth all together with our whole power and assault the ramparts of their camp, which, if with our wonted valour and resolution we carry, and put the Turkish commander to flight, or slay him, and get his head wherewith to terrify the rest of the barbarians, which may Almighty God in his mercy grant, there is no doubt that you may easily get the better of the rest of these plunderers when separated from their companions and surrounded by your forces, and either kill them or take them prisoners as you may think best. But beware, my good soldiers, lest you be tempted by the desire of pillage to sack and spoil the camp, for many a time such greediness of spoil has been the cause of victory being taken from the victors, and given into the hands of those who were vanquished. This counsel of their general was universally approved by the army, and with the consent of all the soldiers immediately followed. The troops being marshalled and set in battle array, were drawn out of their hiding places into the open fields, and discovered themselves to the Turkish scouts, who, from the tops of the hills, gave notice of their approach to those who were in the camp, by fires blazing on high. The sound of trumpets was then heard from the camp, much to the grief of the Turkish soldiers who were dispersed abroad and engaged in spoiling and plundering the country. Many of them, upon hearing the summons, retired within the trenches before the Christian soldiers could reach them. Many were unable to get into the camp, and, while laden with spoil, were charged by their adversaries. The trenches were assaulted on all sides, and at the first charge the carriages and baggage, which had been placed as a barricade, and the targeters who were set to guard them, were overthrown with great noise and confusion, increased both by the Turks, who were excluded, and by the efforts of the Christian soldiers to enter the camp with them. The Turks and Christians were so closely mingled together that darts and shot were useless. They fought hand to hand with their swords and iron maces, a short weapon often used by the Turks. It was strange to see the infidels fighting with their weapons in one hand and their booty in the other. The fury of the assault continuing to increase without intermission, and the place being filled with slaughter and dismay, Mustafa, who had kept himself in the safest part of his camp, and had rather stimulated his soldiers than acted the part of a soldier himself, seeing no hope of resistance left,
escaped from the danger by the swiftness of his horse through one of the ports which was least exposed to the enemy. The fierceness of the conflict after that immediately abated. Some threw down their arms and surrendered themselves. Others followed the example of their general and fled for their lives. Many of the Turks who had wandered far in the quest of plunder, hearing the distant tumult and cries raised in the camp, and suspecting the ill fortune of their fellows, also endeavoured to save themselves by flight. Few of them, however, escaped, for troops of archers lying in wait along the ways dispatched them with their arrows. Some relate that the whole army of the Turks, except Mustafa and a few of those who were best mounted, was slain in that battle. But, in the opinion of Lavardin, those come nearest the truth who write that the number of those who fell was about 5,000, and not above 300 made prisoners, most of whom were grievously wounded and disfigured, in the consequence of the fury to which the Albanians were roused by the sight of the plunder taken from their countrymen, and the devastation of their lands. Of the victors, not more than 20 horsemen and 50 foot are said to have been missing after the battle, more of whom were overrun by the horses than slain by the sword of the enemy. The Albanians thus gaining possession of the camp, the ensigns, the baggage and the carriages of their enemies, they also made an incursion into their territories, where they obtained booty sufficient to remunerate them for the losses sustained by the depredations of the Turks. It is reported that about this time, Lek, or Luke, Zachary, was murdered by Lek Dukagin. Zachary was possessed of a moderate territory within the Upper Zadrima, the capital of which was Daina, or Dana. The two princes being neighbours, and Zachary being without issue, and having no hope of lawful heirs, Dukagin, it is probable, thought that he should be able to get possession of his inheritance, and he accordingly seized upon a great part of his territory as soon as the murder was committed. He could not, however, succeed to the extent of his wishes, for the inhabitants of Daina, the capital town and chief fortress, remained faithful to their deceased prince. They, with great loyalty, defended the rights of Lady Bola, mother to Zachary, who was very aged at the time of her son's death. She, being very much grieved at the loss of her son, and deeming the defence of his estate too much for her to endure, retired to Scutari, or Skodra, and surrendered to the Venetians what remained of her son's principality, together with the whole charge and burden of the contentions likely to arise respecting it with the neighbouring princes and lords. This event was the cause of war between the Venetians and Scandabeg, as shall appear when we have first noticed the measures pursued by Amurath after the defeat of his army in Epire. On the return of Mustafa from his unfortunate expedition, he was loud in the praises of the Albanian prince, extolling highly his invincible prowess and matchless experience in the art of war, often repeating that it was necessary to provide a far different armament, and to make war on a much greater scale than had hitherto been done, that the fury and rage of Scandabeg was not to be tamed by such inroads and predatory expeditions, which only tended to encourage the Albanians, who were a spirited and brave nation, that wiles and ambushments were not likely to prevail against him who was a master in warlike subtleties, but would always prove the ruin of those who should make use of them against him, that by such frequent victories the Christians would gradually conceive a contempt for the Ottoman name, that, in his opinion, it would be best either to abstain altogether from making any attempt upon Scandabeg, or to prosecute it with such vigour as to ensure speedy and complete success. Amurath was not pleased with these praises bestowed upon his adversary, yet he did not impute the Pasha's arguments to want of courage, since Hali Pasha and Ferisay, who had also been as unfortunate, if not more, than he, excused his failure to the Sultan. Amurath, in consequence of these representations of his generals, determined to discontinue active warfare with the Albanians until he should march against them in person. In the meantime, however, he ordered Mustafa to levy new forces and to proceed to the borders of Epire, but not to overrun or lay waste the country, or on any account whatever to think of attacking Scandabeg, or to suffer himself to be drawn from his post, but to be content with carefully guarding the Turkish frontier. When Scandabeg was informed of the approach of Mustafa, and of the death of the Prince of Daina, both events being reported to him at the same time, he was greatly perplexed. The coming of the Turks, whom he had so often vanquished, did not trouble him so much as the murder of his intimate friend the prince, which overwhelmed him with grief. He was vexed, moreover, to hear the determination of Lady Bossa, and that the Venetians had espoused her cause, and made the quarrel their own. He felt himself much aggrieved by the pretension of the Venetians to any right in the estate of the deceased, since he considered the resignation made to them by that lady as of no force concerning what her son had, during his life, directed to descend to him, and that the rash determination of the mother could not lawfully make void the will and intention of the son. For a compact had been entered into between Scandabeg and Zachary, confirmed by a solemn oath, that whichever of the two survived, the other should inherit the dominions of the deceased. In this divided condition of his affairs, Scandabeg, more watchful than ever, kept near to the forces of Mustafa, and coursing up and down with a small number of men, he endeavoured, by sometimes adventuring himself too far, sometimes pretending a hasty and disordered retreat, to draw out the Turkish general to battle. But, finding all his efforts to circumvent the wily Turk fruitless, he left the forces which he had with him upon the borders of the country, to watch the enemy and prevent them from committing depredations and violence. And, turning his attention to the war of Daina, he, with very few attendants, returned to Croia. When there, as he knew that the question between him and the Venetians must be decided by force of arms, he commanded an immediate levy of troops. He himself, together with some of his chief officers, rode to different parts of the province, and assembled a large army. Then, without delay, before the garrison of Daina had time to provide themselves with corn, he laid close siege to the place, and endeavoured, by both force and persuasion, to induce the inhabitants to yield themselves up to him, for he apprehended that when the Venetians received news of his attack, they would send succours from Italy in order to oblige him to raise the siege, yet that he might not exasperate the Dainians, and render them more obstinate in their defence, he refrained from wasting the country, nor did he batter the walls with artillery, or attempt to enter the town by assault, but, by keeping the inhabitants from supplying themselves with food and munitions, he threatened them with famine, of which there was great danger, and with all the evils of a long and tedious blockade. The governors of the nearest provinces, subject to the Venetians, gave notice to the Seigneury of Venice of the attack upon Daina, who ordered an immediate levy of forces of various kinds, which were sent to the relief of the town. These troops were greatly augmented and strengthened by two persons, Lectusman and Peter Span, both of them Albanians. They had, under oath, promised Scandabeg their continual service and assistance against the Turks, in which they had never failed, but their alliance with the Venetians was so intimate that they now considered themselves bound to espouse their cause. Scandabeg was not daunted by the dangers which threatened him. He forthwith divided the army he had just levied, which exceeded 14,000 men. Only 7,000 horse and 2,000 foot were destined to act against the Venetians. The remainder he left to continue the siege of Daina, which he determined not to raise, notwithstanding the approach of the enemy. The forces of Scandabeg were thus separated into 3 divisions, one of which was opposed to Mustafa, another besieged Daina, and the third was directed against the Venetians. This disposition of the forces of Scandabeg gave his enemies hope of obtaining advantage over him. The result, however, will show that he did not act unadvisedly. Mustafa was greatly elated at this diversion made by the Venetians, and encouraged by the absence of Scandabeg, he would willingly have attacked the Albanians who were left upon the borders, had he not been restrained by the positive orders of the Sultan. While the Venetians, assembled at Scutari, consumed the time in making provision of things necessary, Scandabeg had boldly passed the river Drainon into their own territory. The Venetians could not tamely brook this bravado, but immediately marched forward to meet the Albanians. Each party claimed to have justice on its side. The Prince of Albania was contending for the possession of a town, which he asserted to be withheld from him contrary to all right and justice. The other party fought to maintain the rights of those who had placed themselves under its protection. The Albanians were encouraged by the success which had often crowned their arms. The Venetians hoped for victory, both because of the warlike preparations which they had made for the present occasion, and because they knew their resources to be such as could repair any immediate disaster which might chance to befall them. In truth, this enterprise against Daina appeared to threaten the downfall of Scandabeg. When the armies came into sight of each other, they both maintained silence, halted and encamped. The command of the Venetian army was committed to Daniel Juric of Sabenka, an experienced officer. When he appointed his men to their proper places, previous to the combat, he addressed to them a speech wherein, among other things, he set before them the miserable condition of the Dainians, the injustice as well as the rashness and malevolence of Scandabeg in making war against the Venetians, his want of military skill in dividing his army and coming against them with forces so inferior to those opposed to him, and the evident ruin which he was about to bring upon himself. The speech which Scandabeg made to his men before he drew them forth to battle is reported to have been in a much more moderate strain than that of the Venetian general. He observed that while the enemy were in sight, it was not a proper time to inquire into the justness of his cause. Yet, that since good men before going to battle were wont to be anxious about nothing more than to be assured that they were not going to fight against God as well as man, he was quite willing, if they felt distrustful of being in the right, or thought him rash and ambitious in undertaking the present war, that they all should truss up their baggage and return home. But he observed that nothing can be more reproachful to him that is nobly minded, nor anything more repugnant to the dignity and majesty of a prince, than, through pusillanimity, to suffer his right to be usurped by another, and to remain with his hands idle, when he knows that his right can be maintained only by force of arms. He reminded them that they all knew the strict and intimate friendship which was ever between him and the Seigneur Lek Zachary, and that in consequence of their mutual affection they had entered into an inviolable agreement that whichsoever of them should first die without issue should be succeeded by the other in his heritage and dominions, by the virtue of survivorship and existing compact. That the Venetians had gotten possession of the lands of his deceased friend, and had left him only the heritage of tears and lamentations over his cruel fate. He asked them if he did not by that agreement hazard the renouncing of his own patrimony if he had been the first taken out of this life, and he declared that there was no reason why he should, and that he would not, unless God being against him, he was put to the worst, give over the war until he had gained possession of Daina, since none but fools could blame him for a war to which he was prompted by such good reasons and so honest a cause. But he would not have them treat these as they would other enemies, that they had not now to deal with savage barbarians, but with Christians, against whom they should contend according to the rules of just warfare, only to repel injustice, and to be enabled to live in rest and security. The above are but a small part of the speeches reported in the work from which this account is chiefly taken, but they are thought quite sufficient, as the words of the speakers are not pretended to be given by our author. The moderation displayed by Scandabeg in his address to his soldiers increased their confidence in him, They flocked around him, and with many protestations of devotion to his person, and arguments in favour of prosecuting their enterprise, manifested the greatest alacrity and ardour. He, to use the words of our author, praising and extolling the affection of every of them, speaking aloud unto them in a manner of jesting and merriment, smiling he told them that nature was to blame in that she had not placed these noble and generous spirits of the Albanois in a higher and better fortune. Scandabeg then caused his troops to take refreshment, and, having also done the same himself, he, about noon, with a cheerful mind, drew them out into the field. The archers and light-armed troops he placed in front of the ensigns. The heavier armed foot were placed on the two wings, to each of which were added 2,000 horse. The main battle was committed to the command of Tanusi, where a number of foot soldiers were dispersed among the men-at-arms. He appointed no reserve, in order to show the confidence he had of victory, neither did he leave more than a handful to guard his camp. He trusted, in case of defeat, to the forces which remained at the siege of Daina, to the camp at which place it was his intention to retire, should he, contrary to his expectation, be obliged to retreat. Since neither the situation of his present camp, nor the number of his troops, would render it advisable for him to retire thither, Scandabeg has not escaped the charge of rashness, unworthy of a great commander, in not providing for a more safe retreat in case of being defeated. He seems on every occasion to have so well understood the power of his own forces, and they were so completely manageable under his command, that perhaps the charge of rashness may be more properly laid to those who censure him for his conduct on this occasion. The right wing of the Venetians was commanded by Daniel, strengthened by a chosen guard of Sclavonians. Colahumoi of Scutari, who was second in command, led the left wing. His brother Andrew and Simon Volcathania commanded the centre. I think it best not to attempt a minute description of the manner in which the battle was arranged, nor of the various turns in the engagement itself, as I do not feel certain of understanding the antiquated phraseology of the author by whom I am guided. Lavardin says, "In brief, all the ranks were filled indifferently with soldiers of sundry sorts, serving rather for a hindrance and impediment than for any defence or good assurance. The number of Venetian troops amounted to nearly 13,000. The fight was begun by the Venetian pikemen and Albanian archers of the centre. The archers at first had the better of the pikemen, but when the ranks approached so near to each other, the bowmen could not fight to advantage, and the targeters, covering themselves with their targets, and the other light-armed troops came to fight hand-to-hand with the sword. Then Scandabeg ordered his archers to retire a little, and covering them with his cavalry, he afforded them better opportunity to make use of their weapons. The Venetian pikemen, being armed with strong corslets, advanced so boldly as to excite in their companions a hope of victory. The wings on both sides then engaged. The Albanians exceeded in the number and quality of their horse, and the battle was fought in the midst of a large plain near the river Drinon, so that they suffered no impediment from the nature of the country. The contest was a long time maintained around the general of the Venetians, with doubtful success, until Scandabeg, with a body of horse, broke through their battle, and would have cut off all hope of victory from his enemies, had it not been for the Illyrians, who, with their wonted agility, came to the aid of the bodyguard, and enabled them to keep their ground against the Albanians, yet rather acting upon the defensive than as assailants. The armies maintained the contest for a long time, but at length the general of the Venetians, perceiving his soldiers in every quarter put to flight, he also put spurs to his horse, and followed the example of the rest. The troops of Scandabeg could not pursue their adversaries with vigour, because the fight had been so long and so obstinate that their strength was nearly exhausted. Yet, weary as they were, they did not suffer the flight of the Venetian troops to be without interruption, for Scandabeg had commanded that all ensigns should join in the pursuit, even to the gates of Scutari. Many prisoners were made by the Albanians, for Scandabeg had ordered that none should be put to death. And, when they arrived near to the town, and in sight of the inhabitants, they drew up in battle array, with their colours waving in the wind, and their prisoners exposed to the view of the townsmen. Scandabeg, having permitted his men thus to exult in their victory, at length, when the day was far spent, ordered a retreat to be sounded, and the army took up their march towards Daina. Scandabeg hoped the victory he had obtained would induce the inhabitants of that town to submit themselves to him, but in this he was disappointed. When he returned to the siege with his victorious troops, he displayed the ensigns which had been taken from the Venetians, and marched the prisoners around the walls. But when he demanded that the Venetian garrison should be delivered up to him, the answer which he received was, in substance, that they were determined to hold out to the last, and that they were in hopes that the Venetian government would not suffer the bonds of the captives to be perpetual, nor the siege to be of long continuance. Instead of being incensed at this resolution of the Dainians, he exhibited no marks of resentment, nor did he treat his prisoners with severity, but, on the contrary, having behaved kindly to them, he set them at liberty, all but two of the highest quality, named Andrew Hamoy and Simon Volcathania, whom he detained as hostages. These were kept under safe guard in the fortress of Petra Alba, but liberally and respectfully entertained. It is supposed that Scandabeg hoped thus to gain by generous conduct those whom he failed to reduce by force. Scandabeg next entered upon the execution of a plan by which he hoped to advance the progress of the siege of Daina and of the war with the Venetians. At the foot of Mount Sardaniki, called by the common country people Marani, were the ruins of an ancient town named Belize. Distant from Scutari 12 miles, from Drivasta 5, and 15 from Daina. It had of old been laid in ruins, as some say, by Attila. This place Scandabeg determined to rebuild, thinking that, if it were well garrisoned, it would afford him the means of annoying the Venetian territory, and of preventing succours from being sent to the relief of Daina. He, without delay, set about carrying this his purpose into effect, and having restored the place somewhat to the condition of a fortified town, partly by walls, and partly by palisades and other fortifications of timber work, and having furnished it with men, he appointed Amis, his nephew, and Marin Span, or Spaniard, an Albanian of tried prudence and fidelity, to have charge of the place, and to see the work completed. This done, he, without any delay, repassed the river Drynon to prosecute the siege of Daina, which he would not, on any account, suffer to be intermitted. And here one cannot avoid admiring the courage and determined perseverance of Scandabeg, thus to permit no dangers or difficulties to deter him from his purpose. But, while threatened on one hand by the Turks, and on the other by the Venetians, to maintain what he conceived to be his right, and to be for the honour and advantage of his country. When the fortifications of Belize were completed, Amis, prompted by his youthful ardour and the success which had attended him in some unimportant inroads upon the enemy's territory, resolved to take by surprise Drivasta, a town not far from Belize. His heart was so much set upon this enterprise that he did not hesitate to weaken his garrison in order to effect it, being in hopes of accomplishing his purpose without the aid of his uncle, and before he should receive any intimation of it. Marin, who disapproved of the attempt, fearing to excite the ill will of Amis if he openly opposed him, endeavoured secretly to discourage the minds of the soldiery, but failing in this, he at length declared his mind to Amis, representing to him, in a wise and grave manner, the rashness of the proposed attempt, and the mischiefs which might result from it. This wholesome advice of Marin Spaniard was very ill received by Amis, and at first very insolently treated. He replied that he had been left by his uncle with equal authority, and that he was not placed there to be directed, either in peace or war, by the will of another, that he should command his troops in his own way. After a time, however, he became more modest and moderate in his language and behaviour. He told his colleague that he would be willingly swayed by his opinion if the protection of Belize and the affair of Dravasta could not both be secured at the same time, but that neither need interfere with the other, that the forces under their command were sufficient for both, that he did not unadvisedly undertake his proposed attempt, that he would be upon the town of Dravasta so suddenly that he should find the young men unarmed, the gates unguarded, and the walls without sentinels. Besides which, that many of the inhabitants were disposed to yield to him upon receiving a summons, but that supposing the enterprise more difficult than he expected, it was not his intention to expose his men by a long-continued attack upon the town. He ended by taking the hand of Marin and bidding him to be of good courage and to hope for the success of his undertaking. He then displayed his ensigns and marched cheerfully forward. There were scarcely 2,000 men left for the defence of Belize, not that any one of them had been compelled to follow Amis, but because the Albanians were less pleased with inactive warfare than with the assaulting of towns and strongholds. Although Amis had been as careful as he could to conceal his intended attempt, and hastened on with as much speed as possible, yet the news of his approach reached Dravasta before him. The inhabitants, from the beginning of the attack upon Daina, had kept courts of guards in different parts of their town, and a number of armed men to keep watch. At first, however, they were much astonished, and, mounting upon the walls, made preparation of such munitions as were fit to repulse an enemy. But when they saw the forces of Amis draw near, and perceived how few they were in number, their apprehension was changed to contempt. Notwithstanding the undaunted countenance of the garrison, the young chieftain advanced with undiminished confidence, and, in the name of Scandabeg, summoned the place to surrender. But receiving a bold and disdainful answer, he was filled with anger and indignation, and retiring about 1.5 miles from the walls, he consulted with his army in what way it might be possible, seeing he had no artillery, to bring the inhabitants of the town to terms. In meantime, to prevent surprise, he posted scouts and sentinels around the place where he was encamped. The townsmen, at the instigation of Andrew Angel, one of the principal citizens, and distinguished by his long experience in arms and his warlike actions, resolved to anticipate their enemies, and to attack them before they should assault the town. After addressing the forces in a speech containing the usual topics of encouragement, Andrew Angel led them forth, while they expressed their alacrity by loud shouts and cries, which were augmented by those of the troops upon the walls, and by the sound of trumpets. The sudden and unexpected approach of the Dravastines caused great alarm among the troops of Amis. He, however, headed a troop of those whom he could most readily assemble, in order to keep the enemy in check until the rest of his men, who were scattered abroad in the country, could have time to return, and, together with those who were in the camp, set themselves in battle array, and march out to join their commander and the troops whom he had already led forward. But the wise counsel of the skilful captain of the forces of the enemy frustrated the purpose of this young and inexperienced leader. Angel, dividing his forces into 3 parts, sent a company of battalions and some horsemen to attack the camp on the upper side. The rest of his cavalry, being mostly archers and peasants, he directed to prevent the stragglers from re-entering the camp, and to intercept those who were within the trenches if they sallied out. He himself, with a 3rd troop, attacked Amis, and, at the first onset, overthrew his battalion, and put him to flight. Nevertheless, he and his companions, making their way through the squadron of archers, saved themselves in the open country. The different bodies of the Dravastine forces having joined themselves together, they attacked the camp, and after some resistance, drove from their trenches the troops of Amis, who fled on all sides, fighting and fleeing at the same time, towards the open plain. Angel did not pursue his enemies, but, being content with frustrating their attempt, he ordered a retreat to be sounded, and retired joyful into the town. Amis, having gathered up his scattered forces, in revenge for his discomfiture, of which the disgrace was greater than the loss, and abandoning all hope of taking Dravasta, turned his anger against everything without the town which he could destroy, burning the houses and cutting down the trees, not sparing anything that served for use or for pleasure. Nothing remained but a few olive trees, for the abundance of which the place was remarkable. These depredations, committed by the troops of Amis, did not provoke the townsmen to sally forth and risk another encounter, as they apprehended falling into some ambuscade and having their return to the town intercepted. When Amis had vented his fury upon the environs of Dravasta, instead of returning to Belize, where he felt ashamed to meet Marin, for contemning whose wise counsel he was so sadly disgraced, he directed his march towards Daina, where he experienced a much worse reception from his uncle than he would have met from his fellow commander. Scandabeg, having received an account of what had passed, was grievously offended with his nephew, and as soon as he knew of his arrival he sent for him, and, in the presence of all his companions, very much to the mortification of the young soldier, reproached him with the fault he had committed. He laid to his charge the innocent blood of his companions, which, through his folly, he had caused to be spilt, calling him, with a loud voice, both rash and arrogant, for having, without any authority from him, acted so foolish a part. When, upon inquiry, he found that the expedition had been undertaken without the concurrence of Marin, his anger was greatly increased, and he moreover severely blamed Amis for adding cruelty to his rashness by wantonly destroying the property of the citizens which lay without the walls of the town. Amis did not pretend to offer any excuse for his conduct, but turning a little aside to his companions, he exclaimed, "Good God! There is nothing more infamous than a man that is vanquished, for he must, on one hand, endure the insults of his enemies, and, on the other, the wrathful countenance of his friends." Hereupon, all the bands gathering around Scandabeg entreated him to mitigate his anger and to forgive the fault, alleging that the youth of his nephew was sufficiently punished, and his misfortune greatly aggravated by the severe rebukes which he had suffered, and that they themselves were as much to blame as he. Such was the generous nature of Scandabeg that he was not long proof against these intercessions, but soon suffered himself to be entreated and his anger to be pacified.